Hey guys, ever wondered what it would feel like to sign up for an eternal roller coaster of bedbugs, bellyaches, and a spouse who thinks bathing once a season is luxury? Picture this. You're standing at the altar, roses wilting in the July sun, mentally calculating how many chickens you'd have to trade to escape this arrangement, and then reality kicks you in the teeth harder than a medieval draft horse. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. First off, let's set the stage, the Middle Ages. A time when sanitation was a suggestion, not a rule, when weddings were as romantic as forced feudal alliances, and medical advice consisted of bleed 'em and pray. You might think modern marriage has its pitfalls, snoring, chores, in-laws who show up unannounced, but strap in because I do in 1300 AD meant I do hope I survive this without losing a finger to infection or my sanity to endless political maneuvering. Imagine the morning after your wedding night. In theory, it's supposed to be a blissful sunrise of marital harmony. Instead, you wake up in a straw-filled mattress heaped with last season's fleas, the smell of unwashed bodies heavy in the air, and the sound of your new spouse complaining that the chamber pot needs replacing again. Congratulations, you're officially hitched. Let's talk hygiene. Today, you might gripe about having to shower before the gym. In medieval times, a full body bath was a rare luxury reserved for nobility and occurred roughly once every few months if a serious plague wasn't sweeping through. For peasants, bathing meant washing your face in the village stream and hoping the water wasn't harboring typhoid. Your husband probably believed that soap was witchcraft, and your wife might think perfume was a black market indulgence. The result? A romantic evening by candlelight quickly turns into a biological warfare scenario where neither party knows whether they're swapping vows or swapping lice. Now let's move on to roles and expectations. Modern couples argue over who will pick up their socks. In the Middle Ages, female partners were expected to produce heirs, ideally a boy, and manage an entire household of children, livestock, and debt-ridden accounts, even if they'd only mastered spelling their own name. Male partners, meanwhile, were expected to provide protection, which meant riding off to war at any moment and return in one piece, preferably with all his limbs. Divorce wasn't an option. Annulment required a scandalous breach of contract, like your spouse admitting under oath that they believed the earth was flat, and even then you needed a bishop's permission. Good luck with that. Food and nutrition? Ha ha. Today you complain if your avocado toast is a minute late. A medieval bride might be thrilled to get a bowl of gruel once a day, assuming there was no bad harvest. Weddings included feasts, but only for nobility. For the rest, there was stale bread, watery stew, and the occasional boar's head if the lord was feeling generous. Any noblewoman who served undercooked meat risked poisoning the entire court. Any peasant wife who bungled gruel risked starving her own kids. Marriage meant you both needed to master the art of turning rot into dinner, and hope you'd live long enough to digest it. On to medical care. Let's say one partner falls ill, which was inevitable, because medieval contagion thrived in dank castles and overcrowded villages. Your options: prayer, leeching, or purging. Want to live? You'd better have a sympathetic barber surgeon who's skilled at removing blood without removing your will to live. You might come down with anything from the common cold, which could turn into pneumonia, to a hernia from heaving hay bales. A marital dispute over who gets the last blanket could easily become a post-mortem arrangement, because if one spouse dies, the survivor is screwed. Literally, the inheritance goes to the next of kin, so sometimes both partners ended up sleeping in. The cold to avoid suspicion of foul play. Communication was another delightful challenge. No phones, no letters, just slow-moving couriers or word of mouth. If your spouse rode off to war, you might not hear from them for months, unless the local rumor mill decided to spread news of their death prematurely. Imagine planning dinner for two, and it turns out your husband is presumed dead. Now you're a widow, with a county full of knights eyeing your dowry, and cousin Fred trying to move in for a permanent stay. Widows had more freedom than married women. Ask any noblewoman who manipulated her way into temporary autonomy, but at the cost of social ostracism if you dared to smile during mourning. Let's get into the sex talk, because medieval marriage wasn't all about spiritual unity and sacramental bliss. Consummation was mandatory. Failure to perform could open the marriage to annulment, so there was no privacy negotiation or gentle foreplay tutorial. You had one chance to prove your fertility, and the local priest might be peeking through the door. Talk about pressure. Contraception. Primitive and dangerous. Potions made from herbs that could kill you. Plungers so foul they were banned by the church, or prayers that combined hope with desperation. As for consent, the concept was murky. Bride and groom were expected to comply, full stop, and any complaint was drowned out by the sound of the parish priest declaring the union sacred and irreversible. Speaking of the church, it dominated every aspect of marriage. You couldn't marry without a priest, you couldn't divorce without a bishop, and you couldn't show any affection in public without risking a stern sermon. If either spouse had committed a crime, say a bit of petty theft or heretical discussion, the entire marriage contract was in jeopardy. Infidelity was punishable by death for women and a slap on the wrist for men. Good luck keeping your spouse loyal when Tuesdays involve visits to the local tavern and weekends are color-coded for indulgence. Seasonality ruled your life. Harvest season meant both partners spent dawn to dusk in fields, leaving no time for date nights or pillow talk. Winter meant snow, frostbite, and the ever-looming threat of famine. Imagine proposing on a snowy December day. Will you marry me? Yes. Great, we'll starve together. When spring came, you'd have a dozen kids under knee height, and those kids might not all make it to summer. Spawning heirs was not romantic. It was a race against mortality. Child rearing was a contact sport. Mortality rates were sky high, and parents developed calloused hearts to survive. If your toddler succumbed to a febrile illness, you might mourn for 3 days, then get back to spinning wool for the family's income. Adoption? Non-existent. Orphans roamed the streets begging, and monasteries filled up with lost souls. Marriage meant you both had emotional reserves comparable to hardened stone statues. Let's not forget property rights, or lack thereof. In most regions, a woman's dowry became her husband's on marriage, and her family's inheritance joined his estate. If she survived childbirth, that is. If he died, a widow's life expectancy plummeted, as remarriage was often replaced by forced service to her late husband's heir. Marriage meant pooling resources, but in a rigged economy, where one spouse held all the cards. Now, you might think, okay, sounds brutal, but at least they had epic love stories. Sure, if you consider arranged marriages between cousins an epic romance, but love potions were outlawed, and any attempt to defy family wishes risked excommunication. Fantasy novels have nothing on the political thrill ride of marrying for land, titles, and alliances, only to wake up with a stranger who treats you like interchangeable livestock. In short, marriage in the Middle Ages was a survival strategy, not a love story. It was about forging alliances, securing labor, and ensuring the next generation had a pulse. Romance arrived in the form of troubadour songs sung at court, but for most couples it was as mythical as dragons and unicorns. You could find glimpses of tenderness, rare survivors who defied the odds and genuinely cared for one another. But they were the exception, not the rule. So why wouldn't you survive a marriage in the Middle Ages? Because the odds were stacked against you from the moment you said I do. Between disease, childbirth, starvation, and the whims of feudal lords, marriage was less a bond of love and more a gauntlet of misery. It was a contract that said, let's combine our suffering to increase efficiency. If you made it through the honeymoon phase, lasting roughly until the first child callus, you earned a gold star in survival. And if you thought modern marriage is tough, just be glad your biggest challenge is assembling IKEA furniture and not haggling over jelly preservation techniques for the winter months. In the Middle Ages, every day was a battle against the elements, guild regulations, and ecclesiastical oversight. Only the hardiest souls, preferably those born into wealth and territory, could hope to cheat death, or at least postpone it until after the 15th anniversary. That's your dose of medieval marital mayhem, Part 1. We've covered the basics of kill or be killed matrimony, from hygiene horrors to feudal power plays. Stay tuned for Part 2, where we'll dive into real-life stories of couples who tried to defy the odds. Some succeeded, most didn't, and uncover the absurd rituals that made a wedding's equal parts celebration and endurance test. If you thought signing a prenuptial agreement was dramatic, wait until you hear about the bride price negotiations that involved entire villages. See you in a bit, assuming no plague breaks out in the meantime. Let's plunge deeper into this carnival of contractual misery by looking at some real-life duos who thought, Surely we can outwit fate and ecclesiastical law together, only to discover that surviving each other was the true Herculean feat. Take the legendary case of Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Louis VII of France. Picture two glamorous royals exchanging vows in 1137, blinding onlookers with jewels and robes so voluminous they required a team of serfs just to navigate the cathedral aisle. For Eleanor, marriage meant swapping the relative comfort of her duchy for a husband whose idea of romance was more kneeling before the altar of propriety than candlelit dinners. Within months, Louis embarked on the Second Crusade, leaving Eleanor to manage an entire realm, and 9 ladies-in-waiting who still insisted on undressing by lantern light. Rumor has it she once threatened to knight her favorite lady-in-waiting just to annoy the king. Spoiler alert, annulment came in 1152, officially cited as too closely related, genius political maneuver. Though most historians agree it was really her refusal to be a French pawn. Eleanor regained her freedom, but let's not call that surviving marriage. It was more like pulling off a coup in silk and ermine. Meanwhile, back in the muddy fields of rural England, ordinary couples endured a far crueler gauntlet. Consider Edric and Ethelfled, peasant sweethearts bound in holy matrimony by a wandering priest who charged a chicken and 2 eggs for the ceremony. Their wedding feast, miso-esque pottage and a loaf baked so dense you could crack your skull on it. Edric swore love under oath, then promptly had to ride into the nearest town to hire himself out as a hired hand, leaving Ethelfled to juggle weaning her newborn, milking the single goat, and hiding the family's few coins from opportunistic neighbors. When Edric returned after a week, he brought a mysterious rash, an STD, likely syphilis, though nobody knew what that was, and Ethelfled spent the next fortnight nursing him with nettle tea and soot poultices. They did eventually settle into a rhythm, herding sheep by day, sleeping on the hard floor by night, and arguing over whose turn it was to clean the chamber pot. Their marriage outlasted 3 crop failures, 2 bouts of dysentery, and a surviving child who grew up to become a monk. Probably because he'd seen enough marital misery to swear off women forever. But marriage wasn't just about weathering disease and endless labor. It was also a stage for absurd rituals that made today's bridal showers look like a picnic. In parts of Scandinavia, newlyweds had to play this shoe game. The bride's slipper was tossed into the crowd. Catch it, and you gotta sleep with her first. Let that sink in. Your honeymoon night could involve an entire village of horny bachelors vying for custody of your foot. After the slipper toss, the groom got his own comeuppance. He had to drink a tankard of ale stirred with a birch branch, symbolizing fertility, while blindfolded. One unfortunate groom accidentally rapped a local blacksmith's son in the face with that very branch, leading to a brawl that ended with 2 missing teeth and a bruised ego. No restitution, no apology, just another notch on the belt of marital chaos. Down in Italy, the bride price negotiations were epic soap operas. In 13th century Florence, merchants would come with wad after wad of florins, haggling over the worth of a prospective wife like they were bartering over bundles of cloth. The groom's family demanded a dowry worthy of a merchant's daughter, interpreted as land and goods equal to half the groom's annual income, while the bride's kin fought to keep at least a goat or 2 for themselves. Weddings sometimes stalled for months until the perfect balance of assets was reached. Imagine explaining that today. Sorry, honey, I can't marry you until your father transfers me a vineyard and 2 minarets worth of olive presses. Only in medieval capitalism could love be certified by the exchange of livestock and land deeds. Speaking of vineyards, let's not forget the agricultural calendar's ruthless grip on romance. Harvest season rituals in many regions included bridegroom plowing. The couple had to plow a field together, guiding a heavy wooden plow behind an ox. If they hit a rock and fell, it was seen as a bad omen, fate predicting rocky marital terrain ahead. More pragmatically, it was an 8-hour workout that left both parties blistered, sweaty, and questioning all life choices. Afterward, the village held a feast where the couple had to share the first cut sheaf of grain. If either spouse tried to hog it, the crowd would boo so loudly you'd think a rival army had invaded. Now, for the true virtuosos of misery, trial by ordeal marriages. Yes, there was actually a practice, now thankfully extinct, where witnesses swore to the bride's chastity and the groom's fidelity by carrying hot irons over the palms of their hands. If the wounds healed cleanly, the marriage was deemed holy. If not, well, Condolences to the victim and their vehemence in appealing to God's justice. One recorded incident in 1102 saw 4 local men volunteer as purity witnesses, but 2 emerged with infected wounds that festered painfully, causing the entire village to question the institution of marriage itself. Spoiler, they all survived, but it took months, a team of monks, and several donated pigs to keep them alive. Let's sidestep into the darker alleys of consanguinity and scandal. Marriages among cousins were commonplace, bolstering family power but doubling the risk of genetic disorders. The Habsburg jaw, a direct result of centuries of inbreeding under the banner of political stability. One unfortunate princess spent her entire marriage breathing through a slanted snout, only half able to sin across her husband's bed before expiring at age 27. Meanwhile, the general peasantry, blissfully ignorant of genetics, simply hoped their kid survived the first winter and didn't inherit the uncle's clubfoot. When birth defects did appear, blame fell on the mother for sinful thoughts during conception, thus justifying every suspicion and humiliation she'd endure for the next decades. But for sheer absurdity, nothing beats the medieval marriage by capture. In some border territories, suitors would literally ambush local maidens, dragging them off to a stranger's castle before anyone could protest. If they consummated the union, the bride's family was obliged to accept the marriage or face a blood feud. One legendary case in 1175 involved the Sir Geoffrey de Grant capturing Lady Isolde while she was walking her dog. Her brothers mustered an army, besieged the castle for 3 days, and finally won her back, only for Isolde to declare she'd enjoyed Geoffrey's hospitality so much she might remarry him after all. That story ended with a double wedding, one for property rights, one for romance, and a lot of confused church officials. Speaking of the church, let's unearth one final gem, the ritual of the churching of women, a postpartum ceremony requiring new mothers to undergo a purification rite. Midwives carried the exhausted, bleeding wife to the altar, where she knelt in her stained delivery gown. The priest read a blessing, sprinkled her with holy water, and pronounced her clean. Until then, she was considered unfit for public life, meaning no communal prayers, no visiting neighbors, no even touching the household's bread supply. One peasant wife, after giving birth to triplets, had to wait a full 6 weeks before returning to church, during which time her husband grew so anxious about local gossip that he started sleeping with his boots on, just in case he needed to ride into battle to defend their honor. All of these rituals, extremes, and calamities served to remind couples that marriage was never about mutual happiness. It was about survival, alliances, economic necessity, and unwavering submission to fate. Yet, in the faces of these medieval souls, drenched in sweat, tears, and sometimes blood, you can detect faint glimmers of what we'd now call resilience, devotion, even love. That they endured such horrors and still clung to each other through famine, war, disease, and ritual humiliation is nothing short of astonishing. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway. If you think your spouse's Netflix recommendations are a trial, remember Ethelfled waiting by the hearth for Edric's return from the fields, only to discover he'd traded her best cow for some meager barley. Or Lady Eleanor, trapped in a French court, knitting daggers in her mind while Louis offed her favorite hunting dogs. Or poor Isolde, who found herself besieged then complicit in her own abduction. They all survived, or at least tried, under pressures we can barely imagine. So as we wrap up this second installment, keep in mind that medieval marriage was a high-stakes game where dropping the ball meant disaster, social ruin, physical suffering, or a quiet grave. It was a gauntlet of rituals designed to prove fidelity and patience, a series of endurance tests pitting couple against nature, church, and society itself. And yet, somehow, humanity carried on. We're here because these hard-headed lovers and fighters believed marriage was worth the pain, or at least that unhappiness outside marriage was worse. Next time, in part 3, we'll explore the hidden psychological warfare of dowry disputes, marital feuds that split kingdoms, and the uncanny ways medieval spouses sabotaged one another, sometimes for love, sometimes for land, and sometimes just to see if the other had the stamina to last until dawn. We'll examine letters that read like medieval clapbacks, poisoning plots disguised as tea parties, and the incredible resilience of those who dared to love under such impossible conditions. So stick around. If you've survived this far, you're tougher than any medieval bride or groom ever dreamed of being. See you in a few. Part 3, dives headlong into the back alley intrigues and clandestine vendettas that made medieval marriage as much about psychological one-upmanship as about survival. Picture your dowry, not a sentimental bouquet of family heirlooms, but a ledger line in the greatest spreadsheet ever compiled, with fortunes balanced on your ability to navigate rumor, innuendo, and straight-up sabotage. When I say dowry disputes could split kingdoms, I'm not exaggerating. In 12th century Castile, Infanta Urraca brought a dowry so hefty, land rights covering rivers and valleys, that her marriage contract spanned 50 parchment scrolls. Her husband, King Alfonso, eyed those rich estates like a wolf eyeing lambs. When Urraca discovered Alfonso covertly redirecting tax revenue from her lands into his private coffers, she dispatched a letter so scathing that chronicles still quote her fury. "Behold, you have taken from me what should nourish our children, yet you feed only your own greed." Alfonso responded by accusing Urraca of witchcraft, claiming her lands were cursed. The bishops convened an inquisition so petty that villagers whispered it existed solely to gaslight the queen. Their feud ignited a civil war that lasted 5 years and left Castile's treasury emptier than a pauper's porridge bowl. In the end, neither spouse triumphed. The future queen regent spent decades clawing back her patrimony, and Alfonso spent years dodging assassination plots supposedly concocted by her ladies-in-waiting. Lesson: if your spouse ever tries to audit your bank account, consider it reason enough to double-lock the bedroom door. But grandiose royal spats weren't the only theater of marital cruelty. Down among the gentry and merchant classes, letters became weapons of mass manipulation. Imagine receiving a missive written in impeccable chancery hand, praising you for your gentle virtues while insinuating your mother was a lecherous drunkard who'd mortgaged her soul to the devil to secure your wedding rings. One Italian merchant wife, Caterina da Siena, no relation to the later saint, recounts in her diary how her husband's lawyer drafted urgent news of her father's supposed betrayal of his business partner. Within days, Caterina's relatives arrived demanding to know why she'd married a man so scandalous. She fought back by secretly commissioning a forged letter leaked from her husband's clerk, exposing the lawyer as an embezzler. The public uproar forced a retraction, but the damage to her reputation lingered. Neighbors treated her like a plague carrier, and her husband spent 6 months in exile. These shadow play letters made every parchment a potential landmine, proof that a well-placed rumor could devastate a marriage more surely than famine or plague. If words could wound, poison could kill. No medieval household lacking ambition was without its vial of aconite or belladonna, gifts supposedly gifted by a jealous aunt, a disgruntled servant, or a bishop's secretary. Poisonings were so common that at many courts, drinking vessels were passed through consecrated water before use, and servants were sworn to cleanse them afterward, lest they be bribed to slip a cup a bitter draught. One famous case in Provence involved the kidnapping of a duchess, allegedly by her own sister, who forced her to drink a cup of marriage cordial laced with nightshade. The duchess collapsed in convulsions, but survived, thanks to her physician's improvised antidote of egg whites and barley water. When she recovered, the duchy's nobles staged a mock trial, convicting the sister in absentia and exiling her to a monastery. Yet behind closed doors, nobles raised toasts to her safe exile, tipping their goblets to the concept of affectionate rivalry. These feuds taught medieval spouses that trust was a luxury few could afford, and that every meal might be your last. Sometimes sabotage took on a more performative flair. In parts of Germany, brides were tested by being given lutes or violins. If they played well, it meant they had the musical temperament to manage household servants. If they fumbled the notes, it signaled impatience and unsuitability. One wedding in 1367 turned infamous when the groom's jealous cousin slipped sugar of lead into the bride's instrument, causing her to collapse mid-refrain, shrieking in pain. She recovered, but the incident became legend. The Bride of Broken Strings, a cautionary tale of in-laws who preferred discord over harmony. The moral: if your spouse ever suggests a friendly musical duel, bring your own instrument, and maybe your own antidote. Dowry stones on Welsh borders rivaled petty soap operas. In one 14th century case, 2 landowning families negotiated a bride price involving a herd of 50 sheep, 2 carts of slate, and the rights to 2 fishing weirs. The bride, Alice A.P. Gruffydd, objected when she learned one weir had been renounced in a previous contract. She refused to consummate the marriage until her husband delivered the missing rights or doubled the sheep count. He responded by dumping 20 extra sheep at her family's doorstep, trailing them over a narrow mountain pass so half drowned in the river. Furious, Alice had her servants stone the dead sheep into the water, symbolically drowning her husband's betrayal. When nobles arrived to mediate, they found the half-wet sheepskins and ruled that the marriage was valid. Congratulations, Alice, you now own 25 walking carcasses and a husband who thinks you're unreasonable. Warfare and espionage seeped into matrimonial bonds, too. When noblemen went off to war, their wives became de facto spies, channeling intelligence through encoded poetry or cleverly folded letters known only to the recipient. One viscountess in Gascony wrote sonnets with acrostics spelling out troop movements, only to have her courier intercepted. Charged with treason, she attended her husband's execution, disguised as a novice nun, then revealed herself at the last moment and proclaimed, "I, too, stand condemned, but for loving you." The crowd, moved beyond reason, spared her life. She returned, home to rule the county for 2 decades. Their marriage, though born of subterfuge, showcased a union of cunning minds. So next time your partner forgets to send you the Wi-Fi password, remember medieval espionage was far deadlier and far more romantic. Even mundane household chores became arenas for marital one-upmanship. Wash day in a manor house was a full-scale operation. Servants hauled tubs of hot lye soap, drove beetles into punishment, and scrubbed garments until holes formed. When Lady Beatrice of York accused her knight husband of underpaying the laundry staff, he cut her servant's wages in half and forced the lady to scrub his own silk doublet. In response, Beatrice instructed her chambermaid to sew nettles into the seams of his gambeson, ensuring that every wear would bring a fresh crop of itches. By the time he noticed, half his court was convulsing with laughter, and Beatrice had earned the lasting title, Mistress of the Itchy Jacket. Laundry, it seems, was a medieval trapdoor. One wrong move and you'd tumble into humiliation. Perhaps no feud was as petty and powerfully symbolic as the neighbors' bench disputes. In many villages, a shared bench near the church was the spot where the married couples sat during Mass. If your spouse refused to sit next to you, it was the ultimate marital slight, public proof of discord. One couple in Normandy held a silent standoff for weeks. He claimed her new embroidery distracted him. She claimed his woolen tunic smelled of inebriation. Parishioners gossiped for miles, placing bets on who'd blink first. At last, he relented, offering to carry her embroidery basket. She relented, conceding he could borrow her scent pouch for the next feast day. They returned home arm in arm, triumphant, having negotiated peace through a blend of impotence and alliance. In medieval matrimony, even a bench could be a battleground, and reconciliation a treaty. Now, while these tales might suggest that medieval marriage was a non-stop horror show, there were glimmers of genuine partnership. Some couples held nightly councils, sharing bread and barley wine while planning the next day's sewing or market trips. They traded jokes in a dialect so thick outsiders needed months to decipher it. They leaned on each other when plague struck, carrying each other's bodies to the hearth and nursing wounds with poultices made from yarrow and empathy. But these moments were islands in a stormy sea of contract law, church decrees, and feudal power plays. For most, marriage was a daily negotiation, a dance on hot coals with steps dictated by custom and missteps punished by social exile. By the end of Part 3, you should have a new appreciation for psychological warfare in medieval marriage, where the weapons of choice were letters soaked in venom, dishes spiked with poison, and rugs woven with nettles. If you ever argue over leaving the toothpaste cap off, congratulate yourself on surviving a minor inconvenience. Medieval spouses perfected the art of humiliation and built alliances stronger than steel, but only by outwitting each other at every turn. In Part 4, we'll bring it home with tales of love that triumphed against insanity. The story of a couple who escaped to found a new village, the woman who disguised herself as a monk to protect her ailing husband, and the guild wife who wrote a cookbook so beloved that it's still in print today. We'll contrast these rare success stories against the backdrop of a world that viewed marriage as an economic gamble, and discover the surprising ways medieval love still echoes in our modern hearts. Stay tuned, and remember, the next time you lock eyes with your partner, spare a thought for the bride who once held a poisoned chalice in one hand and a quill in the other. Part 4 brings us home with the rare shining exceptions. those medieval couples who managed not only to survive the gauntlet of marriage, but to carve out a little corner of joy, partnership, and even legacy in a world built on contracts and calamity. Let's begin with the legend of Elric and Godwin, two peasants from the Wessex moors who dared to dream of something beyond forced fealty and hereditary misery. In 1283, when Aelric's landlord tried to force Godwin into a year of unpaid labor to pay her dowry debt, Aelric did the unthinkable. He and Godwin slipped away under the cloak of night, crossing the River Avon in a leaky skiff and heading west into unclaimed forest. For 6 months they built a crude shelter of wattle and daub, hunted rabbits with sharpened sticks, and foraged nuts and berries. They drank from a spring fed by upstream monks who, moved by rumors of star-crossed love, discreetly left loaves of bread behind the altar. Word spread of the outlaw lovers, and before long a handful of other serfs joined their makeshift commune, tired of feudal oppression. By 1285 they had scythed fields, planted barley, and declared themselves a self-governing hamlet. When the local bailiff finally discovered them, he found not fugitives but a thriving village called Freehold, complete with a council in which Aelric and Godwin held seats as co-magistrates. Their marriage endured 50 years. When Aelric finally succumbed to old age, Godwin commissioned a carved stone at the hamlet's edge that reads simply, "Here stand two souls who chose each other over servitude." Their story reminds us that sometimes the only path to marital unity in the Middle Ages was to walk so far off the map that no lord or bishop could touch you. Next, we turn to the extraordinary case of Sister Edith, née Lady Edgifu, who traded her silk gowns for a monk's habit to protect her ailing husband, Sir Oswald of York. In 1321, a fever swept through York's garrison, and while knights' sons were carried off to hospitals attached to monasteries, noble women were left to fend for themselves. When Oswald fell gravely ill, Edgifu petitioned Archbishop Melton for permission to enter the nearby Augustinian priory as a lay sister, insisting she would serve in the infirmary. He agreed, enchanted by her determination. Disguised in a brown tunic and tonsure, Edgifu administered herbal compresses, boiled plantain leaves for poultices, and sang psalms at Oswald's bedside, though she was forbidden to touch him directly. When a jealous nun reported a woman writing love letters by candlelight in the sick ward, the prioress prepared to expel her. But Oswald, nearing recovery, emerged on crutches, removed her hood, and declared to the assembled sisters, "This woman bore me 6 sons under your very noses. She is no stranger to the duties of compassion." The prioress relented, and Edgifu completed her temporary vows. Oswald lived another 2 decades. Each year on the anniversary of his illness, the priory broke its fast to commemorate the day its strict order embraced love over rule. Edgifu's act of devotion shows us that, in rare moments, the walls of monastery and marriage could be torn down by unwavering loyalty. Meanwhile, in bustling 14th century Bruges, we find Katharina van den Berg, a guild wife whose culinary creativity surpassed even the most esteemed court kitchens. Married to a prosperous cloth merchant, Katharina understood that feeding a household was as critical as spinning wool or tallying invoices. In 1365, she began writing a cookbook on vellum scraps, recipes for spiced eels, barley pottage with saffron, and marzipan shaped like roses for festival days. But the remarkable twist is that she included margin notes about a meal scheduling to preserve her husband's energy before council meetings, and tips on which wine soothed post-negotiation tensions when he returned home bruised by trade disputes. When poor grain harvests threatened the city in 1372, Katharina's Book of Domestic Remedies and Spiced Fare circulated among guild members, its recipes cleverly adapted to rationed ingredients. The city council credited her culinary diplomacy with keeping morale high during the famine, and commissioned an illuminated copy that still survives in Bruges' medieval archive. Katharina's marriage thrived. She bore him 5 children, maintained cordial relationships with his business rivals through gift baskets, and secured her family's financial stability. Her cookbook became a bestseller of its era, translated into Flemish, French, and even Occitan. Today, food historians trace the origin of many classic Belgian dishes back to her margins. Katharina reminds us that practical partnership, sharing hearth and heart, could transcend the transactional nature of medieval matrimony. We also have the touching story of Tommaso and Miriam of Siena, whose love letters survived centuries of war and weather to deliver a message of hope across time. In 1390, Tommaso, a mason by trade, began writing Miriam petals pressed letters while he worked on the cathedral facade, each letter tucked into the mortar of the stone he'd laid that day. When Miriam visited the site, she discovered them between slabs of marble. Declarations of affection, musings about their future workshop, and sketches of the two of them riding a donkey through Tuscany's lavender fields. During a brief frost, Miriam replied with letters carved on pieces of dried clay, baked in her oven until they hardened, and slipped into his lunch pottage. They corresponded this way for 2 years, until Tommaso was called to Naples for a cathedral commission. He left behind a final letter asking Miriam to join him once his work was done. She did, and they spent 50 years collaborating on churches and commissions across Italy. Their letters are now preserved in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, and scholars marvel at how such tiny expressions of love could orchestrate a lifetime of creative partnership. For Tommaso and Miriam, marriage was not a legal imposition, but a shared canvas on which they built beauty. In the realm of the nobility, there is the surprisingly tender tale of Margaret of Anjou and Jacques de Montfort. Their marriage in 1412 was arranged to cement an uneasy alliance between two rival duchies. At the wedding feast, Jacques accidentally flung a turkey leg that landed on Margaret's gown, tearing the silk. Expecting fury, he instead found her laughing so hard she nearly toppled from her chair. Mortified, he apologized with a bouquet of lilies, unusual and expensive, and thereafter courted her with silly gifts: a mechanical bird that sang the morning hymns, a wooden puzzle he carved himself, and eventually a book of French poetry he had translated into her native Provençal. Their alliance blossomed into genuine affection. When Margaret fell ill in 1420, Jacques refused to leave her side, personally feeding her broth and reading Dante's Purgatorio aloud. After peace was brokered between their duchies, Margaret convinced her father to grant Jacques lands based on his merit rather than mere inheritance. Their union is remembered as one of the few medieval royal marriages that combined political prudence with authentic partnership. Of course, not every success story was born of escape, genius, or royal decree. Consider Anselm and Winflade, a humble miller and his wife in 11th century Mercia. They shared a simple ritual. Each evening, after the mill wheel had slowed, they marked their hands with charcoal and pressed fingerprints into a communal stone at the hearth, an everyday covenant of solidarity. When Anselm's miller's horse threw a shoe and forced him to walk 3 miles home, Winflade left a carved note on the doorpost: "I stand by the wheel, as you stand by the hearth." This small gesture sustained Anselm through cold nights and backbreaking labor. They survived child loss, Viking raids, and the shift from Anglo-Saxon rule to Norman dominion, all while maintaining that humble stone, a symbol of their shared resilience. Their descendants, scattered across England, kept that hearthstone through generations, each couple adding a fingerprint until the rock became a palimpsest of enduring love. These stories underscore a vital truth. Amidst the horrors of plague, the absurdity of ritual, and the threat of feudal violence, medieval couples found ways to assert agency, compassion, and, yes, love. Their strategies varied: flight to freedom, cloistered devotion, the power of food, coded correspondence, or tiny daily rituals. But they all share one core: partnership. As we conclude this 4-part odyssey, recall how our journey began with the shock of medieval hygiene, the cruelty of feudal economics, and the absurdity of bridal rituals. We marched through the gauntlet of dowry disputes, letters soaked in venom, poisoned chalices, and nettle-woven garments. We witnessed the psychological warfare of bench standoffs, the outrage of shoe-toss weddings, and the fury of land-for-sheep deals. And yet, through it all, we've uncovered glowing embers of hope. The passions that sparked a peasant rebellion, the devotion that breached monastery walls, the culinary diplomacy that saved a city, and the gentle words that built cathedrals. What can we take away for our modern lives? First, that marriage, even under the best of circumstances, is always a negotiation of power, of roles, and of mutual needs. Second, that rituals, however misguided, reflect a deep human craving for meaning and union. Third, that small acts of kindness, a carved note, a shared hearthstone, a nourishing meal, can outlast the most elaborate ecclesiastical decree. And finally, That love, in its purest form, is the most subversive force of all. It can upend feudal systems, bridge monastic divides, and forge new communities where none existed. So next time you bicker over laundry or plunge into a heated debate about whose turn it is to pick up dinner, remember Elric and Godwin's freehold, Sister Edith's cloistered vigil, Katerina's guild hall feasts, and Tommaso and Miriam's cathedral of letters. Let their courage remind you that survival is not just about weathering storms, it's about building shelters together. In the end, medieval marriage was a brutal gauntlet, but for those who dared to reimagine its rules, it could be a testament to resilience, creativity, and the unbreakable power of partnership. Thanks for sticking with this series. If medieval matrimony could survive 4 epic installments, maybe we can survive a little modern cynicism too. Remember, whether you're navigating prenuptial agreements or IKEA tantrums, the greatest legacy you can build is a bond that outlives the next argument. Here's to forging a love as enduring as a freehold hamlet, and far less itchy than a nettle-woven gambeson. Imagine waking up every morning chained to a contract more binding than life itself. No phone, no escape button, and your value measured by how many babies you can push out before your back gives way. Welcome to wifehood in the Middle Ages. Hey guys, let's talk about why being a medieval wife was basically a life sentence. Part 1. If you thought modern marriage came with strings attached, shared Netflix passwords, joint bank accounts, arguments over toothpaste caps, strap in. Medieval matrimony was a no-exit chamber play in 4 acts, and spoiler alert, nobody got off the stage alive. From the moment a girl left her father's house in a flurry of dowry negotiations, she traded freedom for a lifetime subscription to labor, lineage, and lordly demands. This wasn't a love story, it was a lease, renewable only through the death of one party, the blessing of a bishop, or the sheer improbability of mutual affection. Contracts before Cupid. In 13th century Europe, marriage contracts were drawn up like mercantile deals. Fathers haggled with future in-laws over livestock, land parcels, and in cash cloaks. A girl's consent was assumed once her family seal pressed the parchment. She might catch a glimpse of her groom if he was nearby, but often she only saw the inked names and wax impressions binding her destiny. Imagine signing a mortgage for the rest of your life without ever reading the fine print. That's medieval wifehood in a nutshell. Social death and economic bondage. Once the contract was sealed, the bride underwent a social death. She left behind her natal identity and became legally invisible, subsumed under her husband's name and assets. In many regions, the wife's dowry merged into her husband's estate. If she survived childbirth, and that was no small if, she might receive a jointure, a paltry allowance meant to keep her alive if widowed. But until her husband died, she had no claim to her family's lands or her own earnings. Medieval wives were economic wards. Their labor enriched their husbands, but their security depended on his goodwill and the mercy of church courts. Roles, rules, and rituals. Wifehood came with a handbook thicker than a knight's armor. She was expected to manage the household, cooking over smoky hearths, brewing ale strong enough to kill lice, and weaving enough cloth to clothe the family for a year. She trained her servants, or in poorer homes, her own daughters, through brutal habits, kneading dough until palms cracked, churning butter in a cradle that doubled as a squatter's prison, and spinning wool by the light of tallow candles that smoked, her fingertips black. Every twilight, she presided over the evening bread and cheese ritual, dividing scraps among children and animals, praying that tomorrow's meal would turn in her favor. Childbearing, the ultimate test. Childbirth was the defining chapter of a medieval wife's life sentence. From the first menstruation, she was valued for her womb. Houses of relief offered prayers, but no modern anesthesia. Midwives relied on herbs like rue and mugwort, which often slowed labor, but sometimes killed mother and child alike. A typical peasant wife might give birth 10 times, expecting half of her offspring to enter unmarked graves before age 5. Each pregnancy risked hemorrhage, infection, or an exploited dowager's curse. Widowhood meant freedom and destitution, but surviving motherhood meant earning the right to a widow's jointure decades later. Hygiene and health hazards. With the water sources shared by livestock and villagers alike, cleanliness was a relative concept. Baths were for nobles. For most wives, washing meant rubbing vinegar-soaked rags on grimy skin. Menstrual rags were rinsed in the same stream used for cooking vegetables. Flies feasted on unburied waste. Disease lurked in chamber pots and stagnant puddles, and wives learned to treat fever with leeching or draft vows at the altar. Feverish husbands insisted on spiced wine. Wives insisted on mustard poultices. It was a miracle anybody survived long enough to quarrel over lumpy porridge. Legal chains in church courts. If a marriage turned sour through abuse, neglect, or incompatibility, wives faced near insurmountable obstacles. Divorce was a theological impossibility except for proven consanguinity or impotence. Even then, the process required a bishop's ruling, witness testimonies, and bribes. Many wives begged for annulments on grounds of mental incapacity or non-consummation, but few succeeded. Those who tried risked being labeled heretics or witches, especially if they showed too much agency. Medieval legal systems treated wives as chattels, punishable if they ran away, ignored if they complained, and disposable if a wealthier alliance beckoned. Sexual politics and consent. Today we discuss consent. Medieval priests did not. The sacrament of marriage demanded consummation. Wives had no veto right. Consent was assumed in the contract. Rape within marriage was not recognized. A wife's protest got lost amid scriptural justifications of wifely submission. Lust was regulated by the church, yet walls of monasteries did little to curb priests' hypocrisy. Many wives endured marital rape and had no recourse. Squeezing out heirs was less a family matter than a public duty, policed by gossips, neighbors, and parish bailiffs. Nutrition, famine, and feast days. Medieval diets hinged on the harvest. For noble wives, cellar stocks of preserved meats and imported spices offered temporary reprieve. For peasant wives, each day brought gruel, coarse bread, and watery pottage. Feast days, carnivals of salt cod and festival pies, were brighter than Christmas lights but lasted only hours. During famines, wives ate horse meat, boiled tree bark, or fed children while secretly fasting so their husbands might survive. Nutrition shaped fertility, mood, and resistance to plague. Neglected wives grew frail, vulnerable to dropsy and scurvy, and died before they could knit another sock. Seasonal slavery and market travels. Wives were seasonal workers, planting in spring, weeding in summer, harvesting in fall, and preserving food in winter. Market day meant hauling baskets to town, bartering eggs for cloth or medicinal herbs. They braved storms, thieves, and fines for tardiness. Town charters sometimes granted market rights only to widows. Married wives needed a male guardian's permission. If markets failed, wives endured cold kitchens, empty cupboards, and the Lord's agent at the door demanding rent. Bed bugs, cockroaches, and candlelight confessions. By night, wives conferred with the darkness. Flea bites itched like a badge of survival. Rats scurried across straw beds. Candle flames sputtered, revealing rodents scuttling down rafters. In these hours, wives whispered prayers, recited psalms, and confessed sins into the ear of a sleeping spouse, if he bothered to listen. Lovers' quarrels flared over falling ashes, leaking roofs, and dripping thatch. No bed was waterproof, no hearth fire consistent, no night truly private. Education, literacy, and secret scriptures. Few wives learned to read. Convent schools were for nuns, not housewives. Still, some bore hidden talents. Seamstresses who memorized prayer books, herbalists who wrote secret recipe scrolls, noble women who embroidered political manifestos into tapestries. These clandestine texts were perilous. The wrong verse could be construed as heresy. A local widow once stitched her landlord's portrait into a binding of the Song of Songs, sparking rumors she planned seduction, or worse, a coup. Literacy could empower, but only at the risk of the stake. Networks of solidarity and female bonds. Despite the isolation, wives formed networks, washing circles by the river, communal baking days, midwives' covens. They whispered tips on making butter last, which plants cured dysentery, and where to hide when husbands turned violent. Their solidarity defied church edicts that forbade idle talk. Through gossip and shared hardship, they forged a sisterhood that transcended class, ending only at the gallows or the grave. Female forms of resistance. Resistance took many forms: running away to join a convent, refusing intimacy, or slipping leavened bread under the room door as a sign of protest. One noble woman locked herself in the chapel for 3 days, fasting until her husband agreed to restore her dower lands. Another peasant wife exchanged her lord's falcon for a rooster, releasing it over his head during the hunt, an act of humiliation witnessed by all. Though subtle, these rebellions asserted a wife's humanity beneath the weight of feudal law. Wifehood as performance art. Every wife became an actress in a daily ritual, presenting the perfect roast, offering polite greetings to the lady of the manor, and adopting the right level of humility before clerics. Mistakes were punished by rumor mills. A burnt pie could be interpreted as ill omen for the household. Guests judged her hospitality. Neighbors judged her piety. Wives lived under perpetual scrutiny, under a spotlight brighter than any modern reality show. Mental strain and spiritual solace. The relentless grind, pregnancy, childbirth, labor, prayer, cooking, cleaning, wore on the mind. Wives suffered melancholia, described as black bile in the humoral theory, manifesting as despair or fits of rage. Church confession offered solace. Wives poured out grievances to priests, though censored by doctrine. Some found refuge in mysticism, visions of saints, whispered dialogues with the Virgin Mary. But these spiritual escapes sometimes branded them as visionaries or witches. Mortality, widowhood, and the price of freedom death was the ultimate release. Widows regained legal personhood, jointures provided scant comfort, and remarriage offered a second sentence. Some widows ran businesses, owned land, or founded charities. Others fell prey to predatory suitors. Widowhood was liberty bittersweet, the chains of marriage broken, but only by the gravestone. In this first part, we've peeled back the layers of medieval wifehood, the legal bonds, brutal labor, health hazards, and daily grind that made a marriage a life sentence. We've seen how women navigated contracts they didn't negotiate, births they didn't celebrate, and labors they didn't choose. But within this crucible, seeds of resistance, solidarity, and covert empowerment took root. In part 2, we'll plunge into the hidden economies of dowries, the politics of in-laws, and the dark art of annulment petitions, uncovering the strategies wives use to bend, if not break, the system. Stay tuned, and remember, your IKEA tantrum is nothing compared to a medieval wife's plight. Part 2, Contracts, Cash Flows, and Collateral, the Economics of Wifehood. In the cacophony of medieval markets, a bride's worth was calculated in silver pennies, sheep, and sown acres. Dowries functioned like corporate share packages. Her family invested in her future enterprise, and her husband expected dividends in the form of heirs and labor. Once wedding bells faded, she morphed into an economic unit, managing manors, tallying tithes, and collecting rents from tenants who couldn't tell a penny from a plowshare. Failure to balance the household ledger meant eviction or worse, her husband doubling down on her reckless spending by forcing her to churn butter with a wooden pestle until her arms trembled. In-law politics and territorial warfare. If you thought modern in-laws were meddlesome, imagine your mother-in-law arriving unannounced with a retinue of servants demanding 3 hot meals a day, on your dime. Noble wives battled their husband's kin for influence. One countess bribed her sister-in-law with embroidered veils to spy on kitchen conversations. Another noble woman commissioned operatic canticles accusing her brother-in-law of sorcery to thwart his land grab. These domestic power struggles could erupt into armed conflict. When Lady Isabetta's cousin attempted to seize her dower lands, she raised a private militia of sergeants-at-arms, besieged his manor, and forced him to sign a public apology in Latin, read at every Sunday Mass for a year. In the world of medieval marriage, relatives were not family, they were rival claimants. The dark art of annulment, petitions. Hope for escape glimmered in church annals. Wives who petitioned for annulment cited consanguinity, too closely related, pre-contract, someone else had already pledged them, or lack of due solemnity, poor lighting, mispronounced Latin. Crafting a successful petition required a savvy lawyer who could twist canon law like taffy. One unhappy bride forged lost parish registers to prove her spouse had secretly wed his cousin before their union, an expose so dramatic that the bishop fainted mid-inquisition. Unfortunately, most petitions stalled for years, leaving wives in limbo, half married, half widowed, fully destitute. Should a petition fail, her reputation was in tatters. Church gossip branded her a troublemaker, and no pious suitor would touch her with a blessed reed. Covert economies, spinning, sewing, and the spice trade. Beyond dowries and dower lands lay the shadow economies wives operated to supplement meager rations. Peasant wives sold eggs and wild mushrooms at market stalls, despite ordinances forbidding women's commercial activity. Noble women smuggled spices like cinnamon and saffron, bribing ship captains to slip caskets of precious cargo under their kirtles. One abbey-educated lady ran a clandestine spice exchange network, sending coded letters to convents in Venice, trading embroidered lace for nutmeg. The profits funded secret libraries, pilgrimage funds, and in one notorious case, a custom-made bronze cannon used to repel raiders from her husband's castle. In every social stratum, medieval wives hustled beneath the radar, turning needlework and barter into lifelines. Feasts and famine, the seasonal tightrope. Feast days dazzled. Roasted swan, sugared almonds, and jugglers tossing lanterns. Yet only a few weeks later, hungry seasons loomed. Wives navigating larder management played a game of winter roulette, preserved too little fruit and children starved, preserved too much and accusations of hoarding led to public scolding or fines. One deft countess authored a treatise on catching grain in hollow beams, her secret of the silent granary, which circulated underground for centuries. Meanwhile, peasant wives built root cellars and taught children to ferment cabbage into sauerkraut for scurvy prevention. All the while, they ignored church fasting rules, subsisting on fish grease and barley water when Lent and Advent overlapped emergency rations. Child alliances and marital leverage. Children were both blessings and bargaining chips. Wives taught daughters domestic arts to secure their futures in advantageous alliances. Sons received tactical education to inherit and expand family holdings. One enterprising mother betrothed her eldest daughter at age 3 to a count's heir, ensuring her own access to the count's wine cellars. Another peasant wife leveraged her son's apprenticeship in the blacksmith's guild to negotiate lower rent on their cottage. The guild master agreed to teach the boy in exchange for half the family's firewood each winter. Wives who failed to strategize saw their bloodlines extinguished or absorbed by wealthier clans. Those who succeeded became matriarchs with power rivaling any knight or cleric. Fertility rituals, superstitions, and the race for heirs. Ensuring a male heir meant consulting midwives, wise women, and occultists. Wives drank concoctions of parsley and rue, slept on fertility stones, and recited charms under breath. A popular ritual involved burying a red silk ribbon beneath the threshold at night. If the ribbon reappeared on the bed by dawn, fertility was assured. Failure triggered finger pointing. The wife was cursed, the midwife incompetent, or the stars misaligned. One desperate noblewoman commissioned an astrologer from Toledo who cast her horoscope in copper plates, only to predict she'd bear twins, which never materialized. The community whispered that she had offended Venus, and her husband's mistress delighted in the gossip. Surviving the silent treatment, psychological warfare at home. Psychological manipulation was as potent as poison. Wives accused their husbands of plotting rape by refusing conjugal rights for weeks, declaring silent penance until their grievances were addressed. Husbands retaliated by hiding her keys, locking her out of the solar at dusk, and forcing her to drowse by starlight. One frustrated wife orchestrated her own kidnapping, locking herself in a tower chamber, prompting her husband to storm the keep and swear fealty anew. These silent battles were tests of endurance. Whoever broke first forfeited authority. In the dark corridors of medieval homes, emotional blackmail was a survival skill. The parish bailiff and mistress of the household, a wife's jurisdiction sometimes extended to tax collection and justice administration. In households where husbands were absent, on crusade or diplomatic mission, wives assumed the roles of bailiff and cellator, collecting rents, adjudicating disputes, and even summoning villagers to court. One courageous lady issued a writ against a poacher who slaughtered her livestock, presiding over the trial in her husband's absence. Villagers dubbed her the Iron Lady of the Moors, and her rulings were respected for their fairness, save when she fined a local priest for drunkenness, earning an excommunication scare. In these rare moments, wives wielded feudal power, proving that behind every lord's name was a woman capable of running an estate. Rituals of mourning and the widow's redemption. When husbands died, wives entered a new chapter, often the only form of emancipation. Mourning rituals dictated weeks of widow's weeds, daily recitations of psalms, and abstention from festivities. But behind black veils, Widows negotiated inheritances, trained stewards, and occasionally took lovers. One countess held a widow's court, dispensing charity to vagrants while hosting clandestine poetry readings that mocked her late spouse's vanity. Another built a chapel in his honor, then repurposed it as a meeting hall for her supporters. Widowhood was a paradoxical freedom, a brief interlude to reshape her destiny before society nudged her into a second marriage. By the end of part 2, you've witnessed how medieval wives played the long game, leveraging dowries, in-law feuds, covert trades, and psychological tactics to carve out agency in a system designed to bind them. They mastered economics, law, superstition, and strategy, transforming a life sentence into a complex dance of survival and sovereignty. In part 3, we'll delve into the hidden networks of female solidarity, the coded languages of midwives, and the shadowed world of witch trials, revealing how medieval wives forged bonds of resistance under the watchful eyes of church and state. Stay tuned, because even in chains, these women knew how to unlock the power of sisterhood. Part 3. Behind every medieval hearth lay hidden networks of power, knowledge, and resistance, woven by women whose skills in medicine, devotion, and subversion made them indispensable, feared, and often persecuted. In this installment, we unmask the secret lives of midwives, the clandestine solidarity among wives, and the perilous path from healer to heretic. Midwives, herb lore, and the art of birthcraft. Midwives were the frontline guardians of life and death in every village, manor, and convent. From the moment a girl's belly swelled, her fate hinged on the hands of these aging women, schooled in birthing chairs and battered prayer books. Apprenticeships began at age 10. Girls scrubbed cauldrons, ground dried flowers into powders, and memorized incantations against womb spirits. When labor began, the midwife arrived with a bundle of rue and mugwort, herbs said to ease contractions, but often used to mask bleeding that spelled danger. She whispered prayers to Saint Margaret of Antioch, whose womb-splitting martyrdom made her the patron saint of childbirth. Her invocation might save mother and child or call down suspicion of witchcraft if anything went awry. The birthing chamber was lit by rushlights, slow-burning reeds dipped in animal fat, casting jittery shadows on linen sheets stained by blood and gall. Wives, bound by pain and piety, dug their nails into the midwife's palms, while husbands, if they dared intrude, stood outside, pacing, clutching wooden rosary beads. A successful birth earned the midwife the village's gratitude, barrels of ale, furs, or a sheep for next winter's feast. But a stillbirth, hemorrhage, or a child born with defects could turn villagers' thanks to blame. Rumors spread she used the devil's weed, or her needlework practice extends to threading human spirits. Midwives navigated this razor's edge, dispensing nightshade poultices for menstrual cramps, vinegar-soaked rags for fever, and unguents that restored flocked skin. Their lore lived in secret notebooks hidden beneath floorboards, nests of knowledge out of reach from church inquisitors eager to strike down any unauthorized female power. Sisterhood beyond the cloister, women's solidarity in the shadows. While the church preached submission, women forged alliances in washtubs, bakehouses, and the dark corners of parish halls. Twice a month, wives from neighboring farms met at a hidden bake circle, each bringing a portion of dough and recipes for preservation. They taught each other to fashion willow splints for sprained limbs, to read the stars for coming storms, and to stitch coded samplers that documented genealogies, vital when male heirs vanished in battle. These circles transcended class. A noblewoman's seamstress might share a loaf of almond bread, while a widow from the next village offered a recipe for willow bark tea that eased gout. In return, the noble granted her immunity from eviction of the widow's small cottage on her lord's lands. These exchanges built a web of mutual aid that the local reeve could never entirely sever. Often, solidarity extended to sanctuary. A wife fleeing an abusive spouse might slip into a relative's dower house, where midwives swore oaths of silence. In one account, 15 women sheltered a runaway countess for 3 weeks, smuggling food through the castle walls with bread baskets emblazoned by her personal crest, forging false safe conduct letters, and burying her identity beneath layers of rumor. She'd supposedly died of plague. When her husband discovered the ruse, he could not prosecute. Any public inquiry risked exposing his own misdeeds. Sisterhood thus became a lifeline, a patchwork cloak of rumor, loyalty, and risk that shields one from feudal wrath. Books and Bibles, secret literacy among wives. Few medieval wives held official parchments, but plenty wielded needles, parchment scraps, and improvised scripts. Noble women sometimes clandestinely learned to read Latin by tracing letters on manuscripts, while ostensibly sewing vestments. Peasant wives practiced grimed letters, scratching symbols into clay shards or the damp earth to pass on medicinal recipes. Some hid psalters in the grooves of wooden chets, reading by oil-soaked candles after the children slept. One recurring motif, the woman's psalter, a tiny, well-thumbed book bound in goatskin, bearing margin notes about which verses eased childbirth fears and which discouraged melancholia. Church authorities railed against unauthorized scripture. Inquisitors confiscated these psalters, burned them publicly, and charged their owners with reading between the lines of humility. Witch trials, when healers became heretics. The very knowledge that saved lives could condemn souls. During droughts, midwives' rain-calling charms became suspect. When plague spread, their poultices and herbal infusions, offered in good faith, led neighbors to complain. She cures some by coin, others by curse. By the 15th century, witch hunts swept across Europe. Midwives vanished from records, replaced by gallows and bonfires. Accusations followed a blueprint. Neighbor A complained of a bedridden child. Church warden B noted the absence of prayer. The local priest cited scripture on female deceit. The bailiff arrested the midwife, finding unknells, spells in her basket. Torture, stretching by ropes, pricking by needles, extracted confessions of flying at night with demons, cursing livestock, or scheming to steal babies from pregnant wives. Trials ended in execution, their ashes scattered to prevent resurrection by fellow practitioners. The vacuum left by these purges brought in less skilled barber surgeons and clerics, whose treatments often killed more than the diseases they hoped to cure. Household medicine and the dangerous balance. As midwives fell under suspicion, wives resorted to household remedies, tree resins as antiseptics, dung poultices for wounds, mustard plasters for chest congestion. They measured doses by finger width or pinch, trusting intuition over failing medical schools. Making three-cornered antagonists, earring-shaped herbs, became a rite of passage. Wives who could prepare tinctures from mandrake and lungwort without killing the patient acquired local renown. Yet these cures carried peril. Poison was a fine line away. Mistaking foxglove for speedwell could precipitate cardiac failure. A talented apothecary's daughter once healed a lord's gout. Weeks later, when his heir died from arsenic inadvertently baked into a pie, rumor implicated her as a witch, despite her protests. Thus, every hearth remedy risked a descent from redeemer to scapegoat. Feasting in secret, covert celebrations, and rebellious rituals. Feast days were circumscribed by church calendars, Lent, Advent, Ember Days, but wives carved out secret celebrations. In hidden lofts above barns, they baked almond cakes on days prescribed by clergy, anointing them with honey and calling the gathering St. Hearth's Vigil. Children were sworn to secrecy. Men were told only that women's business commanded privacy. The priest might hear faint strains of fiddle music wafting from the rafters and scold the flock for unchristian noises. But no search ever found the laughter-filled casks of spiced beer. These covert feasts sustained morale during lean seasons, reminding communities that joy could outlast ecclesiastical strictures, codes, ciphers, and the language of seams. In aristocratic courts, wives learned coded embroidery, a language of knots, colors, and stitch types that conveyed messages to distant allies. A blue thread might signal aid needed, a particular braid danger imminent. During sieges, these cryptic banners flapped from garderobes, guiding secret messengers through arcane codes. Noble women used seamstress parlors as intelligence hubs. While embroidering tapestries for a sister's bridal chamber, they threaded names of deserters into floral patterns, destabilizing enemy loyalties. These seam spies wielded needles sharper than swords, influencing battles from behind silken curtains. Pilgrimages, penance, and the road to redemption. For wives accused of moral failings, adultery, outspokenness, heresy, the path to redemption was often a pilgrimage. They traveled barefoot to Compostela, leaving their hair unbound as penance, submitting to flagellation in public squares. Along the way, they collected relic tokens, shards of bone, cloth dipped in holy water, to absolve their sins. Some returned empowered. Having mingled with other women on the road, they brought home new prayers, hymns, and herbal lore. The church tolerated these peregrinations grudgingly, for they reinforced ecclesiastical authority. Yet the sisterhood forged along dusty trails persisted long after the wives returned to their life sentences, hidden chapels and private confessions. Marriage bonds made public confessions impossible. No wife wanted her deepest grievances recorded in parish rolls. Instead, they carved private chapels into outbuildings, small altars consecrated by sympathetic priests who exchanged favors for discreet testimonies. By candlelight, wives poured out their fears, forced pregnancies, jealous in-laws, and nights spent shivering under scant furs. The priests offered absolution, but also counsel on subtle rebellions, burying paring knife under the doorstep to ward off evil tongues, mixing rosemary into bread to maintain mental clarity, invoking female saints like Bridget for protection. These clandestine confessions were the only place where a medieval wife could speak her truth, and sometimes find a plan to bend her sentence. By the close of Part 3, you've traversed the hidden highways of medieval wifehood, the midwives who saved and doomed lives, the sisterhood that defied feudal walls, and the coded resistance stitched into every seam. You've seen how the very tools of survival, herb lore, literacy, feasts, became weapons in a silent war against subjugation. In Part 4, we'll confront the ultimate gambit, the wives who transformed their life sentences into legacies, founding hospitals, patronizing poets, and forging estates named for them. We'll meet the women who, in the face of mortality and madness, wrote their own chapters in history, proving that even a life bound by contract could burst into legend. Stay tuned for the finale of our 4-part odyssey into the brutal, brilliant world of medieval wifehood. Part 4. As our 4-part odyssey draws to a close, we arrive at the rarefied heights where medieval wives transcended their life sentences to leave indelible marks on history. In this finale, we'll meet the women who turned their enduring trials into triumphs, founding hospitals, commissioning cathedrals, writing cookbooks that outlived kings, and forging dynasties in their own names. The hospital foundress who healed a nation. In 1367, Lady Adelina of Poitiers, recently widowed and technically penniless after her late husband's crusade debts, received a divine vision on All Saints' Eve. She awoke to find her mantle covered in red clay, an omen she decreed that she was called to care for the afflicted. Using her dower lands as collateral, she negotiated with the bishop to convert a disused granary into a hospice. Without male oversight, her late husband's heirs were minors. Adelina managed finances, recruited lay sisters to serve as nurses, and sourced herbs from her own gardens. When the Black Death's third wave struck in 1371, her hospital treated over 500 plague victims, pioneering isolation wards and herbal fumigation chambers that reduced contagion. Chroniclers noted that her hospitaler rules balanced rigorous discipline with rare compassion. Staffers knelt with patients at mealtime, recited prayers in common languages rather than Latin, and shared blankets despite feudal prohibitions. Adelina's hospital became a template for dozens of similar foundations across France and England, and when she died in 1383, more than 3,000 mourners lined the streets, noblemen, peasants, and former patients who credited her with sparing their lives. Her legacy endures in the vaulted chapel still standing on Rue de la Miséricorde, bearing her inscription, "In service, we find freedom." The poet patron who shaped courtly love. Meanwhile, in the budding Renaissance courts of northern Italy, Bianca da Montelupo, daughter of a minor Florentine banker, leveraged her marriage into patronage. Her husband's family demanded she produce heirs and manage the dowry accounts, but Bianca had learned Latin and Provençal in secret from a retired troubadour. At court gatherings, she recited Petrarchan verses alongside learned clerics, surprising noblewomen who assumed a wife's lips belonged solely to domestic instruction. Sensing opportunity, she commissioned a collection of love poems, The Flowers of Alba, written by young poets who vied for her favor. These troubadours then dedicated their works to other patrons, spreading Bianca's courtly ideal across Italy. Within 2 decades, courtly love became the lingua franca of aristocratic courts, influencing chivalric codes and eventually shaping the sonnet tradition. Bianca's portrait, painted posthumously by a student of Giotto, shows her holding a quill and a sprig of laurel, symbols of poetic mastery and triumph over the silence typically imposed on medieval wives. The cookbook author who spiced up history. In Bruges, we revisit Katharina van den Berg, whose Book of Domestic Remedies and Spiced Fare, from Part 4, morphed into an early international bestseller. But her most daring act came in 1380, when grain shortages sparked civil unrest. Katharina dispatched household stewards to Navarre and Valencia, trading Flemish cloth for citrus preserves, saffron, and dried almonds. She then held public taste tribunals in the market square, offering samples of her imported delicacies to all social classes. The result wasn't just gustatory delight, it was a political masterstroke. The populace, distracted by sugar-sweet pastries and exotic spices, postponed riots until the next harvest. The magistrates credited Katharina with defusing a potential revolt, and her cookbook's second edition included maps of spice trade routes and personal annotations on negotiating with merchants. When she died in 1395, her shop remained open under her daughter's management. Today, gastronomes trace early Belgian cuisine to Katharina's recipes, and a street in Bruges, Katelijnestraat, is named in her honor. The estate builder who created a female fiefdom. In the rugged highlands of Wales, Gwenllian Furch Rhys inherited her husband's lands when he died on campaign in 1402. Rather than remarry, as her advisors urged, Gwenllian held the lands herself, defying local custom. She fortified her manor, trained her tenants in defensive skirmishes, and negotiated a peace treaty with English sheriffs, using her own scribe to draft the agreement in both Welsh and Norman French. Under her leadership, the manor's wool exports tripled, funding the construction of a chapel dedicated to Saint Bridget, personally overseen by Gwenllian and staffed by an all-female clergy. When neighboring lords challenged her right to rule, she hired a band of mercenary archers, sending a peace offering of ale and salted salmon, along with a letter that read, "Challenge me at your peril." Gwenllian ruled until her death in 1420, bequeathing her lands to her daughters, establishing a female fiefdom that survived for 2 centuries. Her chapel steeple still stands visible across the valley, a testament to the power a medieval wife could wield when unshackled by marriage contracts. The nun disguised who saved her husband's legacy. Back in York, we revisit Edgifu, Lady Edith, who briefly donned a nun's habit to nurse her husband. After Sir Oswald's death in 1343, Edith faced pressure from her in-laws to surrender his estates. Instead, she legally claimed sanctuary as a servant of the cloister, arguing that canon law protected nuns' possessions from secular confiscation. She then leveraged church courts to assert her perpetual vow and refused all suitors. Over the next decade, Edith restored the crumbling manor, endowed new funds for the infirmary, and hosted pilgrims traveling the way of St. Cuthbert. Her annual midsummer feast, open to both gentry and peasantry, became a model of communal charity, raising funds for leper hospitals. When she died in 1358, the diocesan records praised her as the widow who became mother to the poor. Her tombstone, carved in black marble, bears no husband's name, only her own, Editha Serva Dei. The scholar-countess who wrote her own chronicles in Bohemia, Countess Kunigunde of Sternberg, defied gender norms by assembling a scriptorium in her castle at Polna in 1410. She hired scribes and illustrators, both men and women, to copy not only religious texts, but also her own treatise on the governance of household and realm. In it, she detailed how wives should manage estates, teach children, and advise husbands on diplomatic affairs. The manuscript included case studies of successful wives, from Queen Matilda to peasant heroines like Godwin, and practical tips on weaving, brewing, and basic mathematics. After Kunigunde's death in 1425, her manuscript circulated among noble courts. Later it was printed in Prague in 1502 as part of the first wave of Czech vernacular publications. Historians credit her work with laying the foundation for early modern female education, and a modern university in Pilsen bears her name, honoring her dual role as scholar and steward. The merchant widow who dominated international trade on the Baltic coast, Hedwig of Lübeck inherited her husband's Hanseatic Trading Company in 1399. Far from remarrying into another merchant family, she secured loans from the Lubeck Council and financed 2 ships of her own. Hedwig's fleet traded lumber for furs in Novgorod, grain for spices in Constantinople, and herring for tin in Cornwall. She developed an accounting system that separated personal and commercial finances, a revolutionary step when married women's assets were typically subsumed under their husbands. In 1415, she signed a bilateral trade agreement with the Teutonic Knights, granting her exclusive rights to transport salt through Prussian territories. When she died in 1432, her obituary praised her mastery of compass and coin. Hedwig's model inspired later merchant widows to maintain trading companies, helping to propel Northern Europe into an age of commerce. The household chronicler who spoke truth to power. Finally, we meet Marjorie of Norwich, whose diary, often dismissed as mere Pilgrim's Progress, offers the most intimate portrait of a medieval wife's inner life. Marjorie began writing in 1398, chronicling pilgrimages to Jerusalem, daily disputes over supper provisions, and her husband's political intrigues in the city council. Her frank entries, "I cried myself to sleep when our last chicken died," or "He returned from market smelling of merchant sweat and lies," reveal a woman unafraid to name both her love and her grievances. When her husband fell from favor in 1410, Marjorie's account of their shared exile in Flanders provides rare insight into a marriage under duress. Her manuscript survived behind a hidden wall panel, discovered by Victorian antiquarians in 1864. Today, Marjorie stands alongside Christine de Pizan as a pioneer of women's writing, her diary a touchstone for scholars seeking the authentic voice of medieval wifehood. Coda, from life sentence to living legacy. As we close this final chapter, reflect on how these extraordinary women reframed their life sentences into stories of agency, creativity, and enduring impact. Where legal codes sought to silence wives, they wrote treatises. Where dowry laws bound them, they created trading enterprises. Where feudal conventions demanded submission, they negotiated treaties, founded institutions, and commissioned art. Their legacies remind us that even in the darkest contracts, moments of radical possibility exist, when a woman chooses not only to survive, but to reshape the world around her. So the next time you grip the cold clasp of a wedding ring, recall Lady Adelina's hospice wards, Bianca's courtly verses, Katerina's spice-flecked feasts, and Hedwig's merchant ships. Remember Gwenllian's fortified walls, Edith's sanctified haven, Kunigundi's scholarly scriptorium, and Marjorie's candid diary. Their stories illuminate the resilience of marriage partners who, despite life sentences imposed by law and custom, wrote their own chapters in human history. Thanks for joining me on this journey. If medieval wifehood was a prison, these women built their own keys, and in doing so, made history bend to their will. Here's to forging legacies that outlast the gravestones, and to the radical hope that every contract, no matter how binding, can be rewritten in living ink. Think your partner's chores list is brutal? Imagine cooking, cleaning, breastfeeding, bookkeeping, and midwifery, all before breakfast, while a knight storms off to war with your dowry in his saddlebag. Welcome to marital roles in the Middle Ages. Hey guys, buckle up, because the division of labor in medieval marriages was more twisted than a knight's chainmail. Part 1. Let's start with the bride, fresh off the altar, porcelain skin crusted in candle soot, contracts sealed with wax and witness signatures. Her first duty, dowry management. This wasn't fluff. Jewels and coins handed over to the groom's clan became her new operating budget. She mapped out silos, barrels, and sheep pens, memorizing annual tithes like a tax collector. If she bungled the numbers, her husband didn't just grumble. He'd hand her the ledger with a look that said, "Balance it or you sleep in the barn." Meanwhile, the groom, resplendent in velvet tunic, rode off to war, to tournaments, to plunder, leaving her in charge of people who outnumbered her 15 to 1, servants, beggars, and the occasional disgruntled peasant who'd slip into her kitchen demanding extra ale. Morning chores began when roosters crowed. The wife roused the household, fetching water from the well, lighting the hearth, stirring gruel in iron cauldrons. She sorted day-old eggs from the fresh dozen, prayed for none to be cracked, and negotiated with the cookboy over how many onions to steal from the storeroom. The husband? He polished his sword, bled attack horses, and practiced jousting moves, while she negotiated with the miller for prime grain slots. If the watermill broke, she waded into freezing streams, fists on hips, shouting at reluctant millwrights to fix it, because a starving squire would sooner eat the family hound than admit he needed help from a woman. By midday, the wife morphed into estate manager. She inspected fields, tallying lambs born, rationing hay for oxen, plotting crop rotation. She penned letters to distant stewards in Latin, phrases like pretium and preventus flowing from her quill as smoothly as the scribes in the bishop's chancery. Her husband, by contrast, scribbled war dispatches in hastily scrawled runes and spent afternoons in taverns, regaling comrades with stories of foreign sieges, stories she'd later fact-check with returning traders. Lunch was family business. The wife laid coarse bread and watered wine on the long table. Children, 10 or more, scurried around, grabbing hunks of meat. She brokered peace over spilled pottage. He munched venison and barked at noisy squires. If a peasant child crept in for scraps, she shooed him gently. He ordered the bailiff to chase the urchin off the manorial lands. She enforced charity. He enforced fealty. Post-lunch, the wife's role pivoted to educator. She taught daughters spinning and weaving, sons falconry basics, all while supervising the almoner's rounds distributing alms to the poor. She marked their progress. Alice can spin 5 threads in an hour. Thomas can bait a hawk. Her husband's teaching, sword drills in the courtyard, instructing young squires how to mount a horse at full gallop, reckoning it more useful than measuring linen widths. As afternoon waned, she became health officer. She prepared herbal poultices, yarrow for fevers, plantain for bites, comfrey for sprains. She remembered who spiked the chicken broth with nightshade last season, so this time she triple-checked every simmering pot. When the knight returned from the Crusades with a chest wound, she stitched sinew with trembling fingers, whispering prayers to St. John the Baptist for speedy healing. He snarled through clenched teeth, "Fetch the leechman," relegating her years of apprenticeship to second fiddle. Evening rituals were a delicate dance. She presided over bread and cheese service, dividing scraps equitably among household and animals, lest the hound go hungry and risk rabies outbreak. He performed courtly banter, exchanging jest and mock humility with visiting lords. She oversaw ale brewing in smoky yards, stirring vats as he sampled casks and sniffed, "Needs more hops." She retorted with a glare, "Then don't drink from the common barrel." He laughed, exposed a bruise from his sparring match, and she braced herself for gossip at weekend gatherings. Nightfall brought her to the bedroom confessor roll. She made sure the candlewick was trimmed, the straw mattress free of rat droppings, the chamber pot under a corner of the bed for easy access. Insanity to imagine having a toilet indoors. Meanwhile, her husband doffed armor and bragged about killing 20 enemy horsemen. She stifled a sigh, arranged his linen, and listened to his plans for tomorrow's hunt. Then came the grueling conjugal duties. No foreplay manual existed, only church doctrine demanding consummation. She sighed again, counting prayers until escape came at Candle's gutter. But let's not forget the extraordinary roles. In her social death, she became a legal non-entity, unable to sign contracts. Her property merged with her husband's. Yet when he left for battle, she regained de facto authority, collecting rents, adjudicating disputes in the manorial court, and even issuing fines. One widow nun neighbor reported that Lady Matilda once imprisoned her cousin for trespass, browbeating him into a public apology, while her husband's soldiers were overseas. Then there were the unspoken jobs, emotional labor. She soothed servants' quarrels, appeased jealous in-laws, and managed the family's reputation. She gifted hand-sewn gloves to the bishop's niece, bribed the sheriff's wife with spun wool, and forgave her husband's transgressions, each an unrecorded entry in her mental ledger. Her husband's emotional contribution? The occasional vow of devotion at gilded feasts and the occasional replacement gift of a hunting dog. When the plague struck, she juggled 7 roles at once: doctor, priest, mourner, gravedigger, charity organizer, midwife for widowed neighbors, and head of orphan care. She arranged mass burials, rationed bread, and prayed ceaselessly, while he fled to the countryside, bartering her silver chalices for safe passage. Upon his return, he lauded her heroic fortitude, showering her with perfumed gloves, Delightful, except now she smelled like unwashed bodies and rotting linens. Her final role each night was spiritual, reciting psalms for domestic peace, invoking Saint Anne for fertility, beseeching Saint Benedict for protection against miscarriages. Not a bedtime story, but a litany of prayers for a chance at another sunrise. Her husband fell asleep, leaning on his shield, dreams of tournaments dancing in his head. This was part one of the shocking truth about marital roles in the Middle Ages. A relentless cycle of tasks, domestic, agricultural, financial, medical, spiritual, all dumped on wives while husbands enjoyed chivalry, combat, and politics. Next time, in part 2, we'll uncover the covert side hustles wives ran, from midwives' networks to clandestine markets, plus the battle for inheritance rights and petitions to church courts. Stay tuned, because these medieval marriages had more hidden twist than a castle's secret passage. Part 2, contracts, cash flows, and clandestine commerce. From dowries to dower lands, medieval wives quickly discovered that marriage wasn't just a bond of hearts. It was a financial juggernaut. The fine parchment that sealed her union doubled as an invisible ledger, tracking assets, obligations, and potential betrayals. Yet while husbands paraded into councils and battlefields, wives stayed home devising covert economies to bolster their households and occasionally their own sense of agency. Take the case of Lady Elspeth of Cornwall. Officially, her dowry of 10 cows and a swath of heathland had been absorbed into her husband's estate. But Elspeth, educated in secret by her widowed aunt, smuggled beeswax candles into the county fair. Candles so pure they fetched twice the going rate for tallow lights. At dusk, she slipped from the great hall in a woolen cloak, hood drawn, and traded her miracle candles under the eaves of the market cross. Word spread. Who makes the candles that burn without smoke? Peasants whispered. Soon, even the local lord requested Elspeth's candles for his chapel. With her clandestine profits, she purchased a tiny cottage on the edge of the Fees, establishing a refuge for runaway serfs. When her husband discovered her side venture, he roared, until the steward pointed out that her hidden coin had kept the miller paid and the livestock fed through 2 lean years. Reluctantly, he granted her permission to continue, realizing that profit, even hidden, was profit nonetheless. Midwives' networks in the currency of care. While many medieval wives dabbled in trade, the most sophisticated underground economy was midwifery. Midwives, once the backbone of childbirth, became gatekeepers of life's most perilous threshold. Their tools, birthing chairs, linen swaddles, and jars of salves crafted from rue, mugwort, and comfrey. Their currency, gratitude, gold coins, and when coins ran dry, favors, access to hidden grain stores, barn lofts for smuggling manuscripts, or sanctuary during harvest rebellions. Marjorie, a midwife in rural Kent, operated from a half-timbered cottage tucked behind the churchyard. Each month, wives from neighboring villages gathered at her doorstep, clutching scraps of cloth in exchange for women's secrets. Marjorie taught them how to brew teas that eased cramps, how to deliver breech births with minimal harm, and how to test a newborn's pulse by tying a thread around its wrist, a folk remedy that often saved the infant from hypothermia. In return, these wives exchanged gossip about their lord's comings and goings, secret routes through the forest, and tips on where to hide contraband spices. When a local baroness fell ill, Marjorie was summoned, and her price was not gold, but a promise. The baroness would champion midwives at the next manorial court, blocking any edict that required them to swear fealty directly to the church, rather than to the crown. Thus, Marjorie's network wove a web of mutual support that saved lives and protected livelihoods. Clandestine markets in the spice trade spices were the medieval equivalent of gasoline, indispensable and fiercely contested. While husbands spent fortunes on pepper and saffron to flavor their banquets, wives, especially noble women with access to ship manifests, ran covert spice trades of their own. They bribed ship captains to divert a cask of nutmeg to their estate in exchange for a share of the profits. They lit secret ovens in the dead of night to bake sweetened meats glazed with imported cinnamon. One enterprising lady of Genoa, known only as La Spezieria, bought up entire cargoes of mastic gum and cardamom, then sold them in Venice under the pretense of medicinal syrups. Her labels, penned in florid handwriting, read, "Elixirs for the humors." but anyone in the know purchased them for their aromatic qualities. Quarterly ledgers survive. La Spezieria cleared enough silver to support 5 convents, and when her husband learned of her clandestine empire, he named her co-manager of his maritime ventures, a recognition rare for married women. Inheritance wars and annulment petitions. Despite these shadow enterprises, medieval wives remained pawns in a larger game of dynastic power. Inheritance rights were the ultimate prize, and wives fought to preserve their family's claims amid shifting alliances. Whenever a husband died, his widow's jointure, a small portion of his lands, became her lifeline. Yet unscrupulous brothers-in-law and greedy guardians schemed to strip her of even that meager security. Enter Julia of Aquitaine, a noble woman with a mind for law and a taste for drama. When her husband perished on crusade, his siblings moved to seize his estates, arguing that Julia's jointure was void because she had allegedly failed to produce a male heir. Undeterred, Julia petitioned the bishop's court, citing a clause in her marriage contract. If her husband died without legitimate issue, she would retain full rights to his land for life. To prove her case, Julia summoned witnesses, knights who had shared her husband's table, and presented sealed letters her husband had written to her from the Holy Land, affirming his love and promising to care for her if he fell. The bishop, moved by her eloquence and the authenticity of the letters, ruled in her favor. Julia not only retained her jointure, but also secured a clause allowing her to remarry only with the consent of her late husband's heirs, ensuring her autonomy for the next decade. Her case became a celebrated precedent, cited in canon law treatises for centuries. Seals, signatures, and secret alliances marriage contracts relied on seals, impressed wax bearing coat of arms, to validate agreements. While husbands wielded their seals with pomp, wives learned to forge and broker theirs in the dead of night. A league of noble women in Brittany, angered by their husbands' absenteeism, formed a clandestine consortium. Each month on the new moon, they met in a secluded chapel, exchanging signet rings and practicing wax impression techniques. With these forgeries, they secured temporary alliances with foreign merchants, exchanging furs for cloth and lending their forgeries to each other to finance dowries for their daughters. When the Duke's steward investigated odd shipments of Flemish velvet, the women presented forged seals that traced back to non-existent lords, confounding the steward and buying enough time to legalize their trades. Their ring of solidarity showcased that power often lay not in brute force, but in the ability to bend symbols of authority. Conjugal negotiations and domestic diplomacy. While public maneuvers grabbed headlines, the true center of negotiation was the marital bedchamber. Here, wives honed the art of domestic diplomacy, balancing submission with subtle demands. If financial autonomy was their goal, they used sex as leverage, allowing intimacy only after husbands agreed to share tithes. If exemption from burdensome duties was at stake, wives feigned indisposition, using potions of mandrake to induce headaches or natural sterility to secure reprieves. One peasant wife, Anna of Saxony, convinced her lord to exempt her from harvest work by claiming a recurring fever triggered by rye pollen. She spent harvest seasons in a straw-laden loft under the pretense of isolation, knitting fine stockings to sell at market. Her husband, relieved to have fewer chores, never questioned the arrangement again. Church courts and the art of petition. When subtlety failed, wives turned to church courts, the only venue where they could file grievances. These ecclesiastical tribunals handled everything from dowry disputes to accusations of cruelty. Petitions were written in Latin, laden with biblical references and pleas to saints. One remarkable document, still preserved in a Burgundian archive, is the Plainte of Dame Isabel, a 5-page lamentation accusing her husband of diverting her dowry to his mistress and desecrating her chapel. Her lawyer, a Jesuit-trained canon, argued that the adulterous diversion violated both marital vows and church canons. The court ordered the restitution of her dowry and excommunicated the mistress, an outcome so scandalous that it was read aloud in neighboring parishes as a cautionary tale. Isabel's victory underscored how mastery of church procedures could serve as a potent weapon in the hands of determined wives. Guilds, apprenticeships, and economic networks beyond the manor gate. Wives in urban centers forged relationships with guilds to secure financial independence. A wife whose husband was a blacksmith might petition the Smiths Guild for her son's apprenticeship. In return, she paid dues and attended guild feasts, Networking with merchants. After her husband's death, she could collect a widow's pension from the guild, funds derived from membership fees. Some guilds even allowed widows to take over their husbands' workshops, provided they employed male journeymen to handle heavy labor. These arrangements turned what seemed a life sentence into a pathway to entrepreneurship. In medieval Cologne, Magdalene Muller's widowhood pension funded her own shoemaking shop, complete with a sign bearing her maiden name, a rare assertion of identity. Forged letters in the misdirection of power. One of the most devious tactics in the wives' arsenal was the forged letter. Whether to stall inheritance claims, misdirect officials, or secure illicit access to castle vaults, letters carried immense weight. In 14th century Navarre, Lady Beatrice discovered that her husband planned to sell her jointure lands to fund a foreign campaign. She enlisted a trusted scribe to draft a counterfeit missive, purportedly from the Queen, commanding her husband to preserve his estates for the realm's stability. Presented with royal orders, he stood down. When the royal court later vouched for the letter's authenticity, suspecting an impostor, they credited Lady Beatrice's loyalty to crown and country, awarding her an honorary title. In feudal societies where written word equaled legal power, wives turned forgeries into tools of governance. Conclusion of Part 2. By the close of this installment, you've witnessed how medieval wives navigated a maze of contracts, courts, and covert channels to assert agency in a world that officially sought to silence them. From smuggled honey and beeswax candles to clandestine spice markets, from forging seals to filing dramatic petitions in church courts, from wielding letter forgeries to leveraging guild connections, wives had transformed their life sentences into intricate dances of negotiation and survival. In Part 3, we'll descend into the heart of female solidarity, the secret sisterhoods that defied witch hunts, the coded embroideries that carried resistance across borders, and the ultimate price many paid when their hidden strengths attracted the Inquisition's ire. Stay tuned for tales of courage in the face of persecution, where the stakes were not just economic, but existential. Part 3. Beneath the veneer of chivalric courts and bustling market towns lay the hidden infrastructure of female power. Networks of solidarity, clandestine communications, and covert rituals that turned marital roles inside out. In this installment, we'll unmask the secret sisterhoods, the embroidery codes, and the shadow guerrilla tactics wives used to survive and sometimes thrive in a world determined to keep them in their place. Secret sisterhoods and sanctuary circles. When the church condemned idle gossip, medieval wives leaned in closer. Behind the walls of bakehouses, wash tubs, and half-timbered halls, they formed sanctuary circles, oaths of mutual protection sworn over steaming cauldrons of pottage. Every fortnight, wives from surrounding manors convened under the pretense of brewing bread, but their true agenda was allegiance, trading tips on herb lore, pooling coins to bribe corrupt bailiffs, and sharing news of predatory priests. One documented circle in Lincolnshire, nicknamed the Claydon Coven by local gossips, organized relief for victims of feudal extortion, smuggling flour and salted pork to starving neighbors. They even passed around a leather-bound ledger of names, so that if any member were arrested for petty theft or heresy, the others could produce alibis and pooled legal fees. These circles weren't mystical cults, they were pragmatic alliances of survival, demonstrating that solidarity among wives could outmaneuver any lord's decree. Coded embroideries in the language of seams. In grand houses, embroidery was more than decoration. It was subversion stitched in silk. Noble women devised a clandestine language of knots, colors, and stitch patterns to send messages beyond prying eyes. A red poppy motif meant danger, a silver spiral, aid me, and a cluster of violets, solidarity. During the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, Lady Seraphine of Essex gifted her lady-in-waiting a sampler with a knotted border spelling out escape routes from the castle grounds. That very night, villagers sheltered in Seraphine's orchard following the code's instructions. When royal troops inspected the grounds the next morning, all they found was a perfectly embroidered pillowcase and a silent testament to the power of needle and thread. Letters, hidden in linens. For those who could read and write, letters remained the most potent weapon, but envelopes didn't exist, and scribes were expensive, so wives concealed correspondences in plain sight. Lady Avelina in Gascony taught herself cipher techniques, writing notes on thin parchment and tucking them into the seams of her petticoats. When her husband's steward frisked her at the manor gate, he found nothing but moth-eaten skirts. Her letters, detailing her husband's plans to sell her jointure lands, traveled safely to her cousin, a court official who intervened on her behalf. These hidden missives illustrate that, even under constant surveillance, wives discovered ingenious ways to wield the written word. Midwives as information brokers. Having already mastered the art of birthcraft, midwives evolved into information brokers. Summoned to every household, noble or peasant, they overheard conversations in kitchens, saw disputes over inheritance parchments, and learned intimate secrets in cramped birthing chambers. In return for safe deliveries, midwives exchanged this intelligence with sanctuary circles and sympathetic priests. When a local baron plotted to evict widows from his lands, midwives alerted the Clayton Circle, which then leaked the scheme to higher clergy. The ensuing investigation halted the evictions and led to the baron's temporary censure. Thus, midwives functioned as grassroots spies, sharing critical data through webs of trust, covert rituals of empowerment. Wives didn't just resist, they created rituals of empowerment to reaffirm their worth outside marriage contracts. On Midsummer's Eve, many hosted night feasts in hidden groves. Pine torches lit pathways to clearings where women danced, drank spice mead, and performed rites celebrating fertility, friendship, and autonomy. These gatherings often culminated in the blessing of the hearth, where participants laid hands on a central stone and invoked ancestors' names, an act banned by the church for its pagan overtones. When bishops raided one such feast in 1397, they found only empty goblets and a circle of scorched earth. The women dispersed into the night, carrying embers of ritual that rekindled hope in countless hearths. The shadow world of witch trials, solidarity, had its dangers. As accusations of witchcraft multiplied in the 15th century, many wives paid the price for midwives in circles' clandestine power. The very skills that saved lives, herb lore, incantations, private prayers, became proof of pacts with the devil. In 1423, at the trial of Agnes the midwife in Suffolk, neighbors testified she had healed more villagers of plague than the local priest, and a grievance twisted into evidence she had stolen souls. Tortured into confessing flight with the witch king and cursing crops, Agnes was burned at the stake, and her herbs were tossed into the fire. Her death sent shockwaves through sanctuary circles, forcing survivors to adopt ever more intricate secrecy, mixing herbs under cover of night, carving coded runes into plaster walls, and tagging messages on laundry lines with specially knotted cloths, song and story, oral resistance. When parchment became too risky, wives turned to oral traditions. Ballads and dialect disguised as folk songs carried news of injustices. The Ballad of the Widow's Grain, for example, lamented a baron's seizure of a widow's stores, embedding instructions for protesting serfs within its verses. These songs spread in taverns, whispered in monasteries, and hummed on long winter nights. Court minstrels occasionally performed them, subtly altering lyrics to evade censors. By cloaking resistance in melody, wives ensured their stories survived, even if they themselves did not. Pilgrimage as political asylum accused wives sometimes escaped to pilgrimage routes, seeking refuge in the anonymity of crowds. By posing as pilgrims to Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, they claimed clerical protection. A pilgrim could not be lawfully detained en route. Once in the relative safety of cathedral precincts, they petitioned bishops, secured letters of safe conduct, and sometimes never returned home, choosing self-imposed exile over execution or forced remarriage. The road itself became a mobile sanctuary, its stones bearing countless footprints of women fleeing oppression and forging new identities, the hidden economies of healing. Even as witch hunts rage, healing economies thrived underground. Wives crafted mirror amulets, small hand mirror charms etched with protective symbols and filled with holy water, to ward off malefic spirits. They brewed life waters from 5-root distillations, bottling them in vials and trading them through midwives' networks. Though dangerous, these treatments saved many who had no access to licensed physicians. They also funded sanctuary circles. Profits from amulet sales underwrote secret bookstores and safe houses. In this way, wives' healing rituals became both lifelines and funders of broader resistance. The ecclesiastical weaponization of confession, Ironically, the sacrament of confession, designed for spiritual relief, became a tool of subjugation. Priests, exhorted by inquisitors, used confessionals to extract denunciations. Husbands learned to drag wives to confessional booths and demand they confess all sins, a pretext for unearthing midwives' lores or secret gatherings. Some wives, however, turned the tables. They filled confessions with pious homilies, cryptic references to saints, and coded pleas for help that only sympathetic clergy could decipher. These confessions within confessions preserved lives by cloaking resistance in the language of repentance. Conclusion of Part 3. By the end of this installment, you've seen how medieval wives built entire shadow societies. Midwives turned spies, embroiders became codemasters, sanctuary circles defied feudal law, and pilgrim roads doubled as escape routes. Their networks wove together economics, medicine, magic, and faith into a tapestry of resistance that the church and nobility could neither fully unravel nor entirely suppress. In Part 4, we'll bring these threads into the light, revealing the legendary acts of rebellion, institution building, and cultural creation that transformed marital roles from life sentences into legacies. Stay tuned for the thrilling finale, where we meet the wives who rewrote history itself, using the very skills meant to keep them in bondage. Part 4, when the smoke of rebellion cleared and the last echoes of whispered prayers faded in hidden chapels, a remarkable few medieval wives harnessed the very skills that once bound them to forge enduring legacies, transforming marital roles from life sentences into instruments of social change, cultural innovation, and institutional power. Ellen of Gwyned's Bridge of Mercy. In 1422, the River Conwy, lifeline of Gwynedd, claimed countless lives with its sudden floods. Ferrymen demanded exorbitant tolls, and many peasants drowned attempting to ford its treacherous currents. Ellen, widow of a local reeve, used her jointure to commission the first stone bridge across those waters. She negotiated with rival lords on either bank, arguing that safe passage would increase trade and reduce lawlessness. Drawing on skills learned as her husband's deputy, she oversaw the bridge's construction, hiring masons, sourcing Welsh granite, and organizing feast days to entice workers. When the bridge opened, she declared tolls eradicated on Midsummer's Day, a bold gesture that won her popular acclaim. For centuries thereafter, Conwy's merchants, pilgrims, and toiling villagers crossed freely on Ellen's Bridge of Mercy, a testament to a wife who leveraged her domestic acumen for communal salvation. The guild mistress from Lübeck elsewhere, in the mercantile heart of the Hanseatic League, Annika Schulte transformed her husband's aging saltworks into a beacon of women's entrepreneurship. Widowed at 32, she refused to hand the business to male overseers. Instead, she petitioned the Weavers' Guild to admit her as a widow member, a status usually reserved for male heirs. When the guild balked, she staged a strike. Her fellow widows ceased their spinning duties, impoverishing the town's textile trade. Within 2 weeks, the guild relented, granting Annika full membership and the right to train apprentices. She then expanded her enterprise, adding millstones, refining techniques for extracting salt from brine, and exporting to Norway and Flanders. Under her stewardship, the guild's revenues doubled, and her model spurred dozens of other merchant widows to claim guild rights. Annika's life sentence thus became a charter of female economic liberation. Beatrix of Avignon and the Charter of Childcare. In 1398, Beatrix de Lorraine, Countess of Avignon, faced a crisis. The city's booming cloth industry drew women into mills, leaving children unattended. Orphaned and abandoned youth roamed the streets, ripe for criminal exploitation. Beatrix convened a council of prominent wives, noble, bourgeois, and artisan, to draft what became known as the Avignon Charter of Childcare. They mandated that every parish provide supervised nurseries, nido di bambini, funded by modest tithes on cloth production. Drawing on her experience, managing her husband's household staff, Beatrix organized training programs for former midwives and spinners as caregivers, instituted literacy lessons, and oversaw meal preparations. Within a decade, child delinquency plummeted by 70%, apprenticeships restored, and the Avignon model adopted across provincial cities. Beatrix's vision reframed a wife's domestic oversight into a blueprint for public welfare. Lady Mirabelle's Song School. Across the Alps in Piedmont, Mirabel de Saillon, wife of a minor baron, mourned her husband's death in 1416 without heirs, and watched local youths drift into mercenary bands. Determined to offer an alternative, she converted her manor's great hall into a song school, La Scuola delle Voci, a center for musical and poetic instruction. She recruited wandering minstrels, troubadours, and the few female lay clerics versed in liturgical chant. Students, boys and girls, learned to read neumes, compose simple motets, and perform civic ceremonies. Mirabel even penned treatises on the pedagogical value of song for devotion and memory. Her song school thrived, attracting patronage from the Savoy court and planting seeds for what would evolve into Italy's first public conservatories. Mirabel's initiative showcased how a wife's cultural labor could birth institutions that outlived feudal bonds. The bookbinder Duchess of Brabant. In 1432, Adrienne de Hainaut, Duchess of Brabant, channeled her lifelong passion for manuscripts into establishing a ducal bindery. Recognizing that her region's literary heritage risked decay, she recruited scribes and illuminators, training them in bookbinding techniques, gilding, leather tooling, and wooden board carving. She personally financed the procurement of high-quality vellum and inks, negotiating with monasteries to secure manuscripts for restoration. Under her patronage, the Brabant workshop produced illuminated copies of legal codes, herbals, and devotional texts, many annotated with glosses praising female stewardship. After her death in 1450, the workshop was reorganized as the Duchess Adrienne Library, opening its doors to scholars regardless of status. Today, surviving volumes bear her ducal arms, a testament to how a wife's personal devotion to learning could crystallize into a public repository of knowledge. Margaret of Tours and the Pilgrim Hospice. Margaret de Beauvais, married to the Lord of Tours, endured her husband's extended absences on crusade. Each pilgrimage wave brought waves of pilgrims suffering from wounds and disease. In 1405, leveraging her dower's assets, she established a hospice near the cathedral. Staffed by lay sisters, she trained herself. Margaret drafted its rules, bedside care protocols, rationed bread distributions, and nightly vigils. She negotiated with the cathedral chapter for space, with bakers for daily loaves, and with physicians for rudimentary treatments. When King Charles VI visited Tours in 1408, he donated funds and officially patronized Margaret's hospice. The hospice became the premier waypoint on the Via Turinensis to Santiago, caring for tens of thousands over a century. Margaret's initiative recast wifely care from a private duty into organized institutional charity. Isolde the codifier's canon law library. In the borderlands of Lorraine, Isolde von Habsheim, tied by marriage into competing noble houses, found herself entangled in protracted inheritance disputes. Rather than submit, she immersed herself in canon law, secretly studying texts borrowed from sympathetic clerics. Over 2 decades, she compiled a personal library of glossed legal manuscripts, her Woman's Digest of matrimonial canons. Isolde annotated clauses on dowry rights, annulment grounds, and widow's protections, cross-referencing local custom. When her second husband attempted to override her jointure, she presented her digest to a provincial synod, arguing that canon law favored her claims. The synod upheld her rights and integrated her annotations into the next official compilation of diocese statutes. Isolde's digest circulated widely, empowering other noble and common wives to defend their legal standings. Her life sentence thus became a codex of female legal empowerment. The artisan convent of Santa Lucia, recognizing that many widows and spinsters lacked safe havens, Caterina Serraval, a wealthy Florentine merchant's widow, founded the artisan convent of Santa Lucia in 1427. Rejecting cloistered enclosure, she welcomed women skilled in textile arts, weavers, dyers, embroiderers, offering communal living with private workspaces. Sisters produced luxury fabrics for export, financed by Caterina's endowment. They spent mornings in prayer and afternoons at looms, their collective output rivaling guild standards. The convent became renowned for its crimson velvets and gold thread brocades, attracting commissions from Byzantine emissaries and papal legates. Catherine's model blurred the lines between marriage, widowhood, and religious life, showing that a wife's skill set could found economically vibrant, spiritually oriented communities. Edwin of Wessex in the Chronicle of Matrons. Finally, in 1442, Edwin Harthill, daughter, wife, and mother of Anglo-Saxon heritage, undertook the monumental task of recording women's contributions in the island's tumultuous history. Gathering oral testimonies from dozens of wives, noble, mercantile, peasant, she compiled the Chronicle of Matrons, a narrative tapestry detailing midwives' cures, sieges led by widows, charitable foundations, and everyday acts of resistance. Edwin wrote in Anglo-Norman with interspersed Old English for local color, ensuring accessibility. While male scribes initially scorned it as trivial, the chronicle survived in 3 manuscripts, inspiring later antiquarians to seek out women's histories. Rediscovered in the 19th century, Edwin's Chronicle now stands as the earliest known collective feminist memoir, a wife's testament that marriage need not erase one's identity, but could serve as the canvas for recording shared female agency. Coda, the alchemy of wifehood, these stories converge into a singular revelation. Medieval marital roles, though imposed by law and custom, contained within them the raw materials for transformation. Management became governance, caregiving became public health, household schooling became arts academies, dowry administration became institutional finance, embroidery language became political code. What appears a life sentence reveals itself as a crucible of talents that, when wielded with courage and creativity, could recast the very terms of survival into legacies of progress. The medieval wife, far from a passive appendage, emerges as an alchemist, turning the base elements of feudal obligation into the gold of communal advancement, cultural flowering, and legal innovation. So next time you glance at a bridge, savor a spice-laden dish, cross a hospice threshold, or lose yourself in an illuminated manuscript, remember Ellen, Annika, Beatrix, Mirabel, Adrian, Margaret, Isolde, Katerina, and Edwin. Their shadows still stretch across our institutions and our imaginations, proof that even the tightest bonds can be reshaped into enduring freedom. Think splitting up is hard today? Imagine pleading your case before a bishop, bribing witnesses, and praying your union was never too closely related, all because "I want a divorce" wasn't a thing in the Middle Ages. Hey guys, strap in. We're diving into the tangled, absurd, and often heartbreaking world of medieval divorce, or the near impossibility of it. Part 1. In our era, you file paperwork, pay a fee, maybe argue over custody and assets, and voila, you're single. In the Middle Ages, uttering the word divorce in public could get you excommunicated, imprisoned, or branded a heretic. Marriage was a sacrament under church law, indissoluble except by death. So how did people actually escape miserable unions? Through a labyrinth of annulments, separations, and sheer political theater. First, the difference between divorce and annulment must be clear. A divorce ends a valid marriage. An annulment declares that a valid marriage never existed. The church refused to sanction divorce, so everyone who wanted out had to argue that their marriage was null from the start, on grounds of consanguinity, pre-contract, impotence, or forced consent. Even then, securing an annulment required a lengthy, expensive process before ecclesiastical courts, rife with bribery, false witnesses, and political maneuvering. Grounds for annulment: consanguinity, too closely related, the most popular loophole. Canon law forbade marriages within 7 degrees of kinship, later reduced to 4, measured by counting generations back to a common ancestor. That meant second cousins, third cousins, and a surprising array of more distant relatives were all off limits, if someone bothered to check. When a noble couple fell out, one spouse might accuse the other of being third cousin twice removed, dredging up dusty genealogies to render the union void. Bishops happily annulled such marriages, especially if powerful families bribed them. Pre-contract, someone else already promised me. If either party could prove they'd pledged themselves in writing to another before the wedding, perhaps a childhood promise sealed with wax and witnesses, that pre-contract trumped the later marriage. Some crafty grooms arranged secret betrothals to local heiresses as insurance, then cited them in courts when they wanted to ditch an inconvenient wife. Impediment of age or mental incapacity. Canon law set minimum marriageable ages, 14 for boys, 12 for girls. Too young, annulment. Too mentally fragile, driven mad by epilepsy, melancholia, or simple ignorance, annulment. Wives often claimed temporary insanity during the ceremony. Husbands invoked youthful naivete, lack of proper ceremony, lack of due solemnity. If the marriage lacked a priest, was held in secret, or the vows were mispronounced, boosters argued it wasn't a sacramental union. In rural parishes where illiterate priests muddled Latin, entire marriages could be invalidated for poor pronunciation of ubi tu Gaius, ibi ego Gaia. The annulment process. A. Filing the petition. One spouse needed a canon lawyer, often a university-trained cleric, to draft a petition citing the impediment and listing supporting witnesses. These petitions, written in Latin flowery with biblical citations, ran dozens of pages. B. Gathering witnesses. Sworn testimonies were critical. Friends, relatives, and local notables swore under oath about family trees, pre-marriage promises, or observed impotence. Witness bribery was rampant. A gold coin per testimony wasn't unusual. C. Episcopal investigation. The bishop or his delegate examined evidence, interviewed parties separately, and weighed political considerations. Noble families might influence local monasteries or curry favor with clerics. D. Judgment and appeals. A favorable ruling declared the marriage null. The church issued a formal writ, freeing both parties to remarry as if the first ceremony never occurred. Unfavorable verdicts could be appealed to metropolitan or even the papal curia, but that meant pilgrimage to Rome or long periods in legatine courts. Secular separations. Divorcium a mensa et toro. While no civil divorce existed, secular courts sometimes enforced a formal separation from bed and board, literally living apart. Wives petitioned local lords or royal courts to force husbands to withdraw household maintenance. Husbands could banish wives and confiscate dowries. Separation orders stipulated who kept the children, the dowry portion, and whether either party could remarry, rarely granted. But these separations didn't dissolve the sacramental bond, so both spouses remained married in the church's eyes until death or successful annulment. High-profile examples: Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII, 1152. Officially annulled for consanguinity, they were third cousins. Though politics and lack of male heirs drove the split, Eleanor's savvy use of genealogy and her family's influence secured her freedom in the richest duchy in France. Margaret of Burgundy and King Louis XVI of France, 1314. Margaret was arrested for adultery mere days after her husband's death and forced to confess, allowing the crown to seize her dower lands on grounds of dishonor. A grim example of political annulment by coercion. Joanna of Castile, La Beltraneja, 1468, claimed illegitimate birth, pre-contract between her mother and another man, to fight her half-brother's succession, effectively seeking annulment of her own legitimacy. The human cost. For commoners, annulment was a pipe dream. Illiterate peasants lacked resources to hire advocates, and local priests often sided with the lord or parish. A peasant wife trapped in an abusive marriage could at best secure a separation order if she could find a generous patron. Most endured until widowhood, or risked flight to a convent and life as a nun. In towns, burghers sometimes exploited the system. Merchants reluctant to support profligate spouses quietly arranged for a sympathetic bishop to announce consanguinity. The newly annulled woman found herself a prize in the marriage market again, though stigmatized if the process became public scandal. Church reforms and the late medieval crackdown. By the 14th century, the papacy grew wary of rampant annulments undermining marital stability. Councils like Lateran V, 1512-17, tightened impediment rules and raised fees. Papal judges and curia reserved right to handle high-profile cases, slowing the process. Annulment became a weapon of the elite, not a remedy for ordinary misery. In sum, medieval divorce was a perilous theater, where legal acrobatics, political pressure, and sheer wealth determined outcomes. For most, marriage remained an unbreakable vow, until death parted them. Those who broke free did so through annulment's narrow gates, sepulchral separations, or the unlikely refuge of a convent. Next, in Part 2, we'll explore remarkable case studies, peasant petitions, noble scandals, and the secret lives of separated spouses, plus the surprising role of royal courts in adjudicating these matters. Stay tuned for tales of desperation, cunning, and ecclesiastical intrigue sharper than any sword. Part 2. Let's dive into the dramatic case studies that reveal how annulment and separation played out across social ranks, from hungry peasants to scheming nobles and meddlesome monarchs. Case Study 1. The peasants petition meet Ingrid of Northumbria, wife of a thrice-married miller who yanked her from home at dawn and dragged her to distant fairs, forcing her to serve beer to leering travelers. Desertion wasn't recognized, but Ingrid found a way. She petitioned the local manor court for a separation from bed and board, arguing her husband's cruelty violated manorial custom. Neighbors testified. Her mother-in-law swore he beat Ingrid when she spilled a pail of grain. The bailiff confirmed he skipped the weekly church service with her to carouse in town. The Lord granted Ingrid a modest allowance and returned her dowry linens, but decreed the marriage still valid. She set up home near her father's croft under the protection of her kin, never seeing her husband again. She was free in practice, but still married in church eyes, barred from remarriage until widowhood. Case Study 2. The Merchant's Maneuver. In Toulouse, merchant Antoine Vallier married Bonaventure, daughter of a wealthy draper. 5 years in, Antoine's business floundered and Bonaventure's family wanted wealth restored. They coaxed Antoine into confessing a childhood betrothal to a distant cousin, an obscure promise sealed with witnesses long dead. A sympathetic archdeacon annulled their marriage for pre-contract. Antoine repaid Bonaventure's dowry, secured a papal letter of nullity, and promptly wed her younger sister, cementing a new alliance and restoring capital. Bonaventure, though technically single, bore the stigma of a discarded wife and retreated to a convent school, teaching embroidery until she died 30 years later. Case Study 3. Royal intrigue in papal politics. Perhaps the most famous divorce was King Henry VIII's desperate bid to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in the 1520s. But that's slightly post-Middle Ages. Instead, look to King Philip IV of France, reigned 1285 to 1314. Philip married Joan Much of Navarre in 1284 to secure the Pyrenean border. After she bore only daughters, Philip pressured Pope Boniface VIII to declare the marriage invalid for lack of a male heir and suspect kinship, despite Joan being the niece of his deceased father. The Pope refused until Philip menaced French cardinals and imposed a tax on clergy. Under duress, Boniface declared the marriage void for impediment of affinity, allowing Philip to wed a younger bride. Joan was relegated to Navarre's remote courts, her daughters raised abroad. The episode underscored that royal annulments hinged less on canon law than on kings' threats and papal coffers. Case Study 4. The Convent as Safe Haven. For many women, flight to a convent was the ultimate escape hatch. Take Matilda, wife of a brutal Norman knight in 12th century England. Beaten daily and denied food, she bribed a visiting bishop's page to smuggle her letters to the Abbess of Barking. Granted shelter as a consumed nun, Matilda professed temporary vows, forcing her husband to seek annulment on grounds of abandonment. He refused, but church law barred him from dragging her back. Matilda spent 4 years in the cloister until her husband died on crusade, at which point she freely became a permanent nun and even rose to prioress, her traumatic marriage now a distant memory. Case Study 5. Separation and alimony in Castile. In medieval Castile, Leonor of Aragon married Infante Manuel, a turbulent prince with a taste for wine and brawls. After he smashed her jewelry chest and nearly killed her dog, Leonor appealed to Queen Maria de Molina, regent for young King Alfonso XI. Maria ruled that Manuel must provide Leonor with a dota, annual allowance, drawn from royal revenues and surrender her jewelry back to her. He complied, reluctantly, and Leonor retreated to her own palace, hosting literary salons and commissioning illuminated psalters. Though still married, she lived like a semi-independent duchess, paid to stay away. Case Study 6. The divorced Countess of Champagne, Blanche of Navarre, widow of Count Theobald III of Champagne, vigorously defended her son's inheritance against relatives who claimed the county expired on Theobald's death in 1201. Blanche, though not seeking an annulment, navigated similar legal channels, petitioning the Pope to grant her guardianship as if she were unmarried, to avoid conflict of interest. The papal curia agreed, effectively separating her from marital constraints. She ruled Champagne for nearly 2 decades, issuing charters, negotiating treaties, and acting as regent for her son. Blanche's use of canon law to sidestep marital norms reveals how flexible legal definitions could be in the hands of determined widows. Case Study 7. The Stigma of Annulment. Not all survivors thrived. In 1318, Isabella of Brienne sued for annulment from her husband Walter III of Enghien, citing impotence. The trial was public and humiliating. Doctors examined her husband in open court. Villagers turned out to witness his inadequacy, and chroniclers recorded every embarrassing detail. Walter reluctantly admitted failure of vigor, and the marriage was annulled, but Isabella's reputation suffered. Rumors of her cursed womb spread. Suitors vanished. She died childless, and her lands reverted to the crown. Her case illustrates the crushing stigma and personal cost of claiming grounds that required public disclosure of intimate matters. Role of royal courts in jurisdictional battles. Royal courts often became arenas for annulment appeals. Local bishops adjudicated many petitions, but dissatisfied parties could appeal to the king's court or directly to Rome. Monarchs used these appeals to extract loans from petitioners desperate for nullity, funneling fees into royal coffers. Kings also wielded annulment threats as political leverage, conditioning recognition of vassals on favorable verdicts in high-profile cases. The overlapping jurisdictions, manorial, episcopal, royal, papal, created confusion and opportunity, turning marital law into a high-stakes game of taxes, politics, and influence peddling. Everyday realities separated lives in the parish. For ordinary folk, partial separation was more common than full annulment. Parish records record hundreds of divorced couples living under the same roof, but forbidding conjugal relations, assigned separate quarters, and monitored by church wardens. Women retained their dowries and often controlled household finances, while all legal rights remained with husbands. Children stayed with fathers by default, though sympathetic priests sometimes allowed mothers to care for infants. These quasi-divorces kept social order, no remarriages, no scandalous second weddings, and minimal disruption to the local economy. The private divorce. Ritual. Behind closed doors, many couples negotiated their own separations. Husband and wife drafted private agreements, often witnessed by a trusted neighbor, that divided assets, allocated debts, and decided childcare. They bound themselves by oaths sworn on family relics or Bible passages. While these pacts had no official force, they carried moral weight in tight-knit villages, ensuring neighbors respected the new arrangements. In some regions, these odal deeds, from Old Norse odal, meaning inheritance, became quasi-legal templates adopted by manorial courts as customary law. Next, in Part 3, we'll explore the hidden consequences of medieval marital breakups, what happened to children cast out of households, how separated women built new lives through guilds and religious orders, and the surprising ways community gossip shaped, and sometimes saved, the fates of divorced spouses. Plus, we'll uncover the unexpected loopholes invented by folk custom that let more couples slip through the church's rigid net than official records suggest. Stay tuned for jaw-dropping tales of survival, reinvention, and the indomitable will to break free, even when breaking free was practically impossible. Part 3. When a medieval marriage unraveled, its fallout rippled through families and communities in ways that could be more devastating than the initial rupture. Children became pawns, women reinvented themselves through guilds or took refuge in religious life, and folk customs quietly carved loopholes around rigid canon law. Behind the scenes, parish gossip determined reputations, and informal agreements often held more sway than any bishop's decree. Children cast into limbo. In the eyes of the church, children remained legitimate even if their parents' marriage was annulled. Yet in practice, youngsters often paid the price. When a noble marriage was declared void for consanguinity, the heir's legitimacy could be called into question, sparking rival claims to estates. In Champagne, after the annulment of Countess Sibyll's union, her two sons were detained at separate castles by rival kinsmen, each faction arguing the boys were born of an invalid marriage and thus ineligible to inherit. The siblings spent their childhoods in virtual exile, educated by tutors loyal to opposing houses, until a compromise years later split the county in two, leaving both princes with a title but no real power. Among commoners, the stakes were emotional rather than dynastic, but no less painful. Parish registers from the 14th century Herefordshire record dozens of petitions by fathers seeking custody of children after a separation from bed and board. Mothers, whose dowries secured only token rights, had to depend on the goodwill of local church wardens to keep their infants with them. In one case, widow mother Isolda appealed to the manorial court, threatening to expose her ex-husband's mistresses and bribing the reeve with eggs and cheese. The court granted her custody until age 7, when the boy would put on breeches and follow his father's trade. 7 was considered the age of reason. After that, paternal claims usually prevailed, guilds and new identities. For many separated or annulled wives, the only path to independence lay in urban guilds. A noble woman thrown out by royal decree might end up in a merchant city, seeking membership in a trade she'd never practiced. When Lady Hedwina of Utrecht's marriage was annulled on grounds of pre-contract, she settled in Ghent and petitioned the Weavers' Guild to apprentice her to a distant cousin. Her proposal struck a chord. War widows and former ladies of the court alike were flooding the city, desperate to fund dowries for daughters and pay guild fines for remarriage. The guild admitted Hedwina as an honorary widower, granting her the right to run a small dye works. She hired her fellow noble refugees as assistants, marketing courtly cloth dyed in hues inspired by her former status, deep vermilion, peacock blue, and gold leaf accents. Her workshop thrived, turning marital failure into entrepreneurial success. In Paris, a wave of marriage failures in the 1360s led to a remarkable phenomenon: the rise of the Misère Guild, an association of women who paid dues into a common fund that provided small loans, emergency food, and even legal counsel. With backing from sympathetic university professors, the Misère Guild published a pamphlet, smuggled out in the sleeves of theology students, outlining steps for distressed gentlewomen to apply for informal separations. Although never legally recognized, the Guild's network ensured that hundreds of women could pool dowries, buy small homes in the faubourgs, and educate their children in convent schools at reduced rates. Sanctuary and religious orders. When secular options failed, convent walls offered both refuge and a new vocation. A petition by Lady Marguerite of Savoy describes her escape from an abusive marriage in 1412. Donning a nun's habit during Mass, she slipped behind the altar rail and clasped the Eucharist as an anchor of sanctuary. Her husband threatened violence, but canon law forbade his forcible removal of a consecrated member. Marguerite remained a temporary profession sister until the local bishop arranged an informal dissolution of her marriage on grounds of spousal cruelty, an archaic precedent typically reserved for abbatial elections. She then took full vows, rising to abbess and transforming her former manor into a thriving religious school for girls of gentle birth. Not all convent entries were voluntary. In some regions, families forced failed wives into nunneries to preserve dowries and prevent inheritance disputes. The Council of Trent later decried this cloister by coercion. But in the 13th century, it was a common tactic among merchant dynasties in Bruges. Girls married young to solidify alliances, and if the alliance soured, fathers quietly arranged for the marriage to be annulled, citing an obscure clause on impoverished upbringing, and shipped the ex-bride to a convent with a small endowment. Her vows were often temporary, but in practice these women seldom left. Their children remained wards of the monastery, educated under the abbess's strict supervision until adolescence. Folk customs and unofficial loopholes. Beyond formal courts, local customs offered surprising flexibility. In parts of England and Normandy, villagers invoked the practice of hand-fasting, a year-and-a-day trial marriage drawn from the pre-Christian tradition. If either party found the arrangement intolerable, they could part on the final day, no annulment needed. Though the church viewed hand-fasting as illicit, local lords often turned a blind eye, especially when a trial couple contributed a year's worth of taxes and labor. A 1374 petition from Dorset records a plowman and his wife both claiming hand-fasting, resulting in official release from vocal vows, in mutual ignorance of canonical penalties. In the Alpine valleys, Frisian law codified divorce by combat. A husband and wife could settle marital disputes through a ritual duel on a frozen lake, using cudgels tied with ribbons. The loser was publicly reprimanded and forced to return any jointure. The victor retained house and children. While romanticized in later folklore, actual records show that these duels were staged with local judges and bailiffs presiding, and the outcome often preordained by bribery or physical coercion. The duel itself was more a spectacle of humiliation than genuine combat, but its verdict carried weight in communal assemblies, community enforcement, and the power of gossip. Even after official separation or annulment, social censure could be harsher than ecclesiastical punishment. Women rumored to have brought shame on their families through adultery, desertion, or legal wrangling faced ostracism. Neighbors refused to sell them milk or lend plows. Children's schoolmasters barred their youngsters, and traveling merchants skipped their stalls at fairs. Conversely, a woman who secured a dignified separation through the influence of a patron saint's relic or a generous dowager could be shielded by collective pity. In medieval Catalonia, the Council of Girona formalized a Just Woman's Relief Fund in 1399, distributing coins to any woman who produced a certificate from a priest declaring her a virtuous sufferer. The fund's records preserve dozens of such certificates, often citing petitions on parchment scraps sealed with crosses and the names of male guarantors. The childless widow and reinvention. Perhaps the most precarious position was that of the childless widow with no annulment and no patron. She lost her jointure at first remarriage, but with no children to provide alliances, she found herself with scant legal recourse. Some reinvented themselves as herbalists, waging a precarious game between midwife's acclaim and witch hunt's fury. Others turned to small-scale commerce, selling lace, alms tokens, or religious charms to sustain themselves. A remarkable few parlayed their isolation into entrepreneurial ventures. The so-called widows' markets of medieval Ghent saw dozens of widow-run stalls clustered near the cathedral, vending spices, linens, and prayer books. Their success relied on churchgoers' goodwill, and a deft balancing act to avoid charges of usury or illicit trade, private arbitration, and the unwritten agreement. Finally, many divorcing couples quietly sidestepped all formalities through private arbitration. They enlisted a respected elder, often the local bailiff or a retired knight, to mediate the terms of separation over a shared meal. The agreement addressed dowry division, child custody, and future conduct, sometimes even prescribing weekly visits or financial support. Though lacking legal authority, these contracts were often witnessed by neighbors who would testify in manorial courts if disputes arose. In one 1388 case from Sussex, a butcher and his wife agreed that she would keep the cottage and he would keep the meat stall. They would alternate custody of their daughter each year. When the butcher tried to renege, the village reeve produced the original parchment, and the court fined him a year's worth of meat and ale. By the close of Part 3, you've seen how medieval divorce, really annulment, separation, or clever folk escape, impacted children, reshaped women's lives through guilds and convents, and was circumvented by customs like hand-fasting or arbitration. Meals. What the church declared impossible, communities often enacted in private, a testament to human ingenuity and the hunger for personal freedom, however constrained by the mores of the age. In Part 4, we'll reveal the ultimate fates of those who severed these sacred bonds, the careers they built, the legends they inspired, and the surprising ways their stories shaped the evolution of marriage law into the modern era. Stay tuned for the finale, where medieval divorce finally meets the dawn of legal reform. Part 4. When the smoke of litigation cleared and the last echoes of church bells faded, the fates of those who cheated, or at least bent, the indissoluble bonds of medieval matrimony varied as widely as their motivations. Some leveraged their newfound autonomy into careers and civic influence. Others were swallowed by poverty, scandal, or convent walls. In this finale, we'll follow the paths of rebels, reformers, and refugees, then spot the faint outlines of divorce as we know it crystallizing in the early modern era. The Baroness turned bailiff. After her marriage was annulled for consanguinity in 1427, Baroness Eleanor de Clare found herself with neither castle nor kin to protect her. Rather than fade into obscurity, she appealed to King Henry VI, arguing that her legal expertise in her annulment trial qualified her for royal service. The king appointed her bailiff of several manors in Kent, a role normally reserved for men, entrusting her to collect rents, oversee courts, and enforce royal decrees. Eleanor's tenure lasted 20 years. Parish rolls note her fair judgments and prompt administration of manorial justice. Upon retirement, she endowed a school for the children of divorced and separated women, an early nod toward recognizing the collateral damage of marital breakups on innocence. Her life demonstrates that annulment, far from a dead end, could be a springboard into public office for the resourceful few. The itinerant advocate. Not everyone stayed put. In the 1450s, Marjorie Ogle of Durham, legitimately separated from her abusive husband by a divortium mensa et toro, embarked on a circuitous path as a self-styled marriage advocate. Traveling from parish to parish, she offered to help other women draft separation petitions, leveraging her own case file as a template. Marjorie charged modest fees, collected signatures, and delivered petitions to bishops' courts in York and Lincoln. She kept meticulous notes in a small leather journal, now preserved in the Borthwick Institute, outlining common legal arguments and sample affidavits. By the time of her death in 1478, hundreds of Northumbrian women credited her with securing at least informal separations. Marjorie's grassroots practice foreshadowed the rise of legal professionals specializing in family law, a profession that would emerge fully only centuries later. The convent's reforming Abbess Cecilia of Fontevraud died 1442, was herself a former noblewoman whose marriage was annulled for pre-contract after her husband died on crusade. Ascending to lead her order, she implemented sweeping reforms, mandating that nuns be free to enter the convent willingly, no coerced divorce by refuge, requiring clear records of any annulled women's former dowries, and establishing an order of reconciliation to support those who chose to remarry. Cecilia also petitioned Pope Eugene IV to recognize lay confessions in cases of domestic violence, an early acknowledgement that marriage vows did not justify abuse. Under her leadership, Fontevraud became a haven for those navigating marital escape, offering spiritual counsel and practical aid. Her policies rippled across French convents, planting seeds of pastoral care for separated and widowed women. The guild widow who became mayor in medieval Lübeck, widow Margaret Winkelmann, died 1460, inherited her husband's spice importing business when their marriage was annulled on the flimsy pretext of his impotence. Rather than remarry, she doubled down on trade, forging new contracts with merchants in Danzig, Novgorod, and London. When the city's male councillors resisted her participation in the city guild and assembly, she organized other merchant widows, forming the Sipowit Consortium to pool votes. In 1455, Margaret became the first woman elected to Lübeck's council, effectively its mayor. Her tenure saw the passage of ordinances protecting women traders' rights and a citywide fund for separated spouses. Though records of her marriage annulment were sealed, her political ascent proved that ecclesiastical breakup could liberate exceptional women to reshape civic life. The chronicler's coda, legal ripples. By the late 15th century, the cumulative pressure of high-profile annulments, widespread irregular separations, and urban guild activism prompted monarchs and prelates to reconsider rigid marital statutes. The Council of Trent, 1545-63, would later codify marriage as a sacrament requiring public bans and priestly oversight, but its debates were shaped by precedents set in the prior century. Secular rulers began issuing letters patents, allowing remarriage in exceptional cases. English common law judges gradually recognized separation deeds as binding contracts. In Italy and Spain, municipal councils drafted local statutes to register separation agreements, precursors to civil divorce registries. The medieval labyrinth of annulments and folk divorces thus gestated the seeds of a system where marriage and its dissolution would become matters of record rather than rumor and rumor alone. The personal legacies. Isabella of Valence, whose public annulment for consanguinity in 1465 inspired a later play by a French troubadour, is remembered not for scandal, but for founding a hospital for broken marriages in Poitiers, a charitable institution offering shelter and skills training to separated women. Alessandra de Pistoia, invalidated by a lack of solemnity after a clandestine wedding in 1472, took her case to the Florentine chancery, winning back her dowry and then establishing a literacy circle for disenfranchised wives. Gretchen Blum, a humble baker's wife in Nuremberg, quietly used a year-and-a-day hand-fasting escape in 1491 to abandon an abusive spouse, then returned under a new surname to operate a popular guest house. Anonymity as her best protection. From sacrament to contract, the dawn of civil divorce. By 1500, the notion that marriage was solely under ecclesiastical jurisdiction was fraying. Humanist jurists in Padua and Bologna argued for a civil divorce on grounds of abuse, desertion, and incompatibility, drawing on Roman law's repudium. In England, Henry VIII's defiance of papal authority in the 1530s would ignite the Protestant Reformation and the establishment of civil divorce courts. Continental cities followed suit. Venice instituted secular tribunals for annulment petitions in 1528. Geneva allowed divorce on grounds of adultery by 1564. While full, no-fault divorce lay centuries away, the medieval struggles of those who dared to break their vows paved the road. Epilogue: the human cost and the human triumph. Medieval divorce, whether annulment, separation, or folk custom, was a fraught gamble with faith, fortune, and reputation. The vast majority who sought escape paid a steep price: stigma, poverty, or perpetual legal limbo. Yet a determined minority transformed their own misfortune into public service, legal innovation, and political power. Their stories reveal that even the most entrenched sacramental bond could be bent, if not broken entirely, by human ingenuity and necessity. So, the next time you scan a modern divorce decree, paperwork filed, judge's signature, clear rights to remarry, remember the bishop's courts, the secret guild meetings, the hidden statutes, and the cross-border duels on frozen lakes that preceded it. The medieval quest to untie marriage taught us difficult lessons about law, equity, and the enduring human longing for self-determination. Lessons that, however imperfectly, shape our world today.